Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Brevos 305 AC. Brienne. She'd been sad when she heard what had happened to Sansa and the sentence the king had given her. In some ways, death may have been more preferable for the girl she had tried to protect, rather than exile in such a form. Brienne was angry too, at the girl and at the world that had made her so. For surely it was the world and not the girl herself who could sink so low. The things that Sansa had suffered had made her who she was, hadn't they? Had she lived the life that she was supposed to, then the girl who'd sought her brother's protection when they went to the wall and who had shown such happiness and relief when they were reunited, that girl would have been the only girl she could have been. Brienne had never understood why Sansa had doubted her brother, but had trusted a man like Littlefinger, nor why she'd been so against the queen without even giving her a chance. She had tried as best as she could to guide her and had failed, though a part of her was certain now that it wasn't just her own failure, as no one else had been able to guide her for true either. Not one of the things that Sansa had said about the king or queen had proved even close to the truth. Both of them were just what the realm had always needed, and she was a clear example that they rewarded not based on what you were, but who you were. They had given her a white cloak, a purpose, and serving a good king and queen was all she'd ever wished it could be. Serving with Jaime and Jorah, sparring with the king, and even listening to Tormund's crude japes and attempts to get her into his bed had made her days far more fulfilling than ever before. Yet she found she longed for battle too. She wished to swing her sword in more than anger, and it seemed that they were drawing ever closer to that point. How long they'd stay in Braavos was not something she knew, and she was surprised when the king, Arya, Tormund, and Jaime went flying one way while she, the queen, and Ragla, Jorah, Daario, Grey Worm, and Missandei went another. She was pleased with the offer of a horse, though, and she felt far better riding by the carriage with Jorah on the other side as they moved to the Sea Lord's palace. Their journey through the city soon attracted a crowd, and she found her eyes moving from the carriage to those that lined the street. At one point, she was sure she saw the strangest-looking woman she'd ever seen, and then heard a sound from Drogon that she'd never heard him make before. Brienne, though, shook it from her mind as they arrived at their destination. "Be alert," Jorah said after she dismounted, and she nodded and then moved to open the carriage door. "Your Grace," she said softly, and almost reverently, as Dany climbed out of the carriage, and she looked on as Missandei handed the princess over to the queen. The palace was huge with domed towers and a large fountain at its front, and Brienne could see men practicing their water dancing next to it, though none were a threat or even looked their way. She and Jorah took up position on either side of the queen and the princess, and with Daario, Grey Worm, and a group of his Unsullied also with them, she felt there was no danger here for either of them. As if to reinforce that, both Drogon and Lyrahax then flew over the palace, the younger dragon flying far lower than the older one, and as they did so, they let out their roars. Brienne could see the beaming smile on the queen's face as she leaned close to her daughter, though she didn't hear the words that were spoken to the princess. They were escorted to rooms and servants were provided should they be needed. The queen, though, simply wished to speak to the Sea Lord and to them move on to the Iron Bank, so they didn't wait too long to do the first of those things. The room they were taken to was as large as the throne room in the Red Keep, although it was far more full of furniture and decorations, and so it looked smaller. There were elaborate tables and chairs, a raised dais, and Myrish rugs strewn out across the floor. When they entered the room, the Sea Lord rose to his feet, and he looked friendly enough when he saw the queen. Though Brienne knew well that appearances can often be deceitful, "The mother of dragons and breaker of chains, long have I wished to meet you, Queen Daenerys. My name is Tormo Fragga, Sea Lord of Braavos, and this is my first sword, Larmo Farragan," the Sea Lord said, motioning to another man. "I am most pleased to be welcomed so, Sea Lord, though I would beg a favor of you, if I may, a letter I'd see delivered," the queen asked. "A favor for you, my queen? It would be my great honor to see it carried out," Tormo said with a smile on his face. "For the Iron Bank, Sea Lord?" the queen said, and Tormo nodded. The queen and Missandei sat down, as did Daario, while she, Jorah, Grey Worm, and the Unsullied did not. Then, when the food was brought in, she moved to stop anyone from eating or drinking any, only for the Sea Lord to beat her to it. "I have no doubt that your guards and advisors, and perhaps even your own history, have left you wary about those you do not know, my queen, or what their motives may be. Let me put you at rest with mine own and show that you are among friends. Tormund said as he clapped his hands. The servants stepped away. Pick any dish or any jug, my queen. Decide which one it is that Tormund must eat and drink from, to show that it's safe for you to do so. With a nod from the queen, Tormund picked a piece of food from a plate and ate it, and then drank from the jug, she decided. He even did so again when the queen picked another of both, and by then even Brienne was relaxed and comfortable enough to believe there was no danger of poisoning here. As she listened to what the man said a few moments later, she then believed there was to be no danger from the Sea Lord ever. Reforce was founded by free men, my queen, men and women who would not be tied down by the bonds of slavery. So for us to have the breaker of chains in our halls is... Tormund stopped speaking when a man hurried in and whispered something in his ear. See that he's shown here immediately. Go quickly, do not delay. Lormo, go with them and make sure it's done. Sea Lord? The queen asked concernedly. And so Brienne moved closer to the table. Forgive me, my queen. The king has arrived, and some of my most foolish of men saw the dragon's landing as a threat. No harm has come to his grace, but tensions were raised, Tormund said, and Brienne saw the queen stiffen a little, and she didn't relax until the king, Arya, Hime, and Tormund walked into the room with Ghost by the king's side. The kiss that was shared between the king and queen, and the one he placed on the princess's cheek, brought a smile to Brienne's face. As did the way the king whispered into the queen's ear and the smile on her face, at whatever was said, her smile, then only grew at the words the Sea Lord said when the king took his seat. Do you intend to break more chains, my queen? Tormund asked almost eagerly as the queen looked to the king, who nodded back at her. We intend to break them all, Sea Lord, the queen said, and Brienne felt her pride flush at that, a good king and queen indeed. Wintertown 305 AC. Sansa Stark. She looked around at the bare walls, the barren floor, and the dirty windows. A bed, a table, and chair, a chest for her clothing, and a shared privy. This was what her life was to be, and she'd rather be dead than live it. The first night she'd stayed here, she'd been so relieved that she'd kept her head, that she'd welcomed even this. Wood had been provided to her for a fire. The bed, though far harder than what she was used to sleep in, was at least warm, and food was brought to her. Those comforts were only thought so by her, because of her relief, and the longer she had sat in this room, the less she liked it. The first night, her food had been prepared for her, but that was no longer to be the case, and she realized to her horror that she would now have to cook for herself. It was not the last horrifying realization that she made, for it wasn't just cooking for herself that he'd now have to contend with. There were no servants to run her bath, and in fact, there wasn't even a true bath she'd found to her dismay. Her clothes would need to be kept clean by her, and her alone, and she'd been aghast to find that the coin she was given was to last her for a moon, and not just a daily expense. That she'd found out to her cost when she'd spent it all on things she deemed essential, though things she now knew were very much not. She'd found out other things too when she'd set foot outside the door for the first time, things that had forced her to stay inside far more than not since then. They didn't wish her here, didn't want her here, and tolerated her presence rather than welcomed it. What was worse was not only did they not appreciate what she'd done for them, they'd not even accepted it was her that had done it. You won back Winterfell? How? Did you swing a sword? Did you fight against the Boltons? Was it you that captured Ramsay and beat him to the ground? The words were spoken dismissively and angrily to her, and yet the anger in them was nothing compared to the anger that she faced when she spoke up about the dragon whore, her bastard brother, and their dragon spawn. I'm a wolf. A true wolf. Not some bastard dragon or some dragon whore. They soiled my family home by birthing their dragon spawn under its roof, and I pray to the Seven that they at least burned the sheets after they'd soiled them so. She said haughtily, she should not have. She knew that now, and she cursed her tongue for letting her down, as she now felt the bruise that had formed on her head. Were it not for the guards, then she may very well not have made it back to this hovel that was now her home, even with them. She was lucky to do so, relatively unharmed, as the screams and shouts she'd aimed at those filthy wretches who dared try to lay their grubby hands on her had not gone down well. For the Princess of the North, a young boy had said, and then Sansa had seen stars as the stone hit hard against her head. It hadn't been some filthy child from Wintertown she'd seen as she'd crashed to the ground. No, it had been a brother that she had given up for dead from the moment she'd heard that Ramsay had held him hostage. red hair and blue eyes and a panicked look on his face as he'd run from the arrows, and as she'd watched from the hill far away and in complete safety. It had been Rickon's face she'd seen and not some foolish boy from Wintertown who'd believed in the lies that dragons spewed. Sansa had not left her room for the next few days. She'd welcomed the attentions of the woman who'd come to see about her injury, and had tried to make a friend only to find that the woman had no intention of ever naming her as such. Another thing that had been stolen from her, she'd thought as she'd sat alone in her room that night. Each day was a struggle. She'd cook her food, place her dirty clothing to one side, and know that she'd need to clean it soon. When she did leave her room, she'd feel the looks as they were directed at her, and she would walk the streets of the filthy town alone and in silence, or she'd be silent at least. A false wolf, a trout, a smelly fish, just like her mother before her. She's lucky she didn't face the flames, or otherwise she'd be a cooked fish. Who knew children could be so cruel? Sansa did, for was she not one of them for the longest time, and had she not been cruel and mean to those she'd named as kin? Horseface, savage, a bastard just like him. Her words haunted her, and she remembered then how she, Jane, and Beth would laugh when Arya's tears fell after they'd spoken those words aloud. She'd never had to face that, not until Joffrey and his cruelty anyway. Sansa had always been her father's princess, her mother's pride and joy, and no one would dare speak words like that to her, not then at least. Some nights she found herself looking out through the window. The lights of Winterfell were always clear for her to see, and she didn't need to close her eyes to imagine the feasts and dances that were going on in its halls. She could almost smell the lemon cakes, feel the softness of her bed, and the comfort of the seats in the embroidery room. Sansa belonged there and not here, not in this place. This was not the life she was meant to lead. She'd seen it, so very clearly she'd seen it when she was on the stand and when he'd brought her to her knees. All the wrongs she'd done, all the mistakes she'd made, and the path she should have taken. Sansa had seen it, and for the briefest moment she'd sought forgiveness for it, pleaded for it, and hoped for it all in equal measure. Had she got it at that moment, then she'd have welcomed death when it came. As it was, she'd almost welcome it now. Climbing into her bed, she felt her tears fall, and sleep was hard to come by. When it did, it was with but one thought in her head and one prayer offered to the gods. "Please wake me from this nightmare that has become my life," she said softly. Braavos 305 AC. Ned Dane. Never did he imagine he'd set foot in Braavos, and as Arianne and Daemon made for a tavern, Ned decided to explore the city. The king had taken flight on his dragon, and the queen had made her way to the Sea Lord's palace. For him, it was through the streets of Braavos that his feet took him. He watched as men fought against men in duels, and he admired how they danced away from each other. Ned looked on as women offered their services in a way he'd never seen before. It was subtle and as much of a dance as the duels, and only that one of his guards explained it to him. Ned would never have considered such a thing. "It's a seduction, my lord," Arlo said. "A what?" he asked, as they moved through the streets. "A seduction. It's not like the Street of Silken. They don't wear their tears like those in Volantis." "Tears?" he asked, confused. "A tattoo of a tear, my lord, to show what it is they are." "They mark them?" he asked aghast. "To them, they are slaves, property, and they're free to do with them as they wish." Ardo said, "But not here?" he asked curiously. "No, my lord. Here the people are free, and they choose what it is they wish to be. Some choose to become courtesans, and others work in houses that men frequent," Arlo said. "Whores all the same, my lord." Yadzad and Ar scoffed. "All men are whores. Jerzlud, or do we not also sell ourselves for coin?" Erdlo said, and Ned chuckled at that as they walked through the streets. He heard the gasp behind him, and as he turned, he crashed into the woman and sent something crashing to the ground. Arlo moved to that while Ned helped her back to her feet and found himself looking into the deepest and darkest set of purple eyes he'd ever seen. As she steadied herself, it wasn't just her eyes that he felt drawn to. The woman's skin was dark and a golden brown, and her hair was as jet black, as dark as any he'd ever seen, bar the king's. She had a look on her face that he couldn't quite place, and he wasn't sure if she was looking at him or past him. "Forgive me my clumsiness, my lady," he said, apologetically. "You're from Westeros?" the woman asked, almost hopefully. "From Dorne, my lady," he said. "Dorne? For true, you're from Dorne?" she asked excitedly. "I am, my lady. Lord Ned Dane from Starfall," he said, and then he had to catch her as she fainted. He carried her in his arms and sent Jarkalad to find a room, or a place where she could rest, and a healer in case there was more wrong to her than had at first seemed. The first was easy to find, the second far harder, and as he laid her down on a bed, it was a courtesan and not a healer who told him that there was nothing truly wrong with her, and it was perhaps just the heat of the sun that had made her faint. The relief he felt at that was palpable, as was the confusion he felt when looking at the thing that had fallen, when he'd bumped into her, and that Arlo had picked up. It was a mask of a sort unlike any he'd ever seen before. A set of metal links that would cover the entire face, except for the eyes, as he held it in his hands. The woman woke up and sat up, almost panicked in the bed before she looked at him with suspicion in her eyes. "Forgive me, my lady. You fainted in the street, and I brought you here to recover. I give you my oath that no liberties have been taken with you, other than I carried you in mine arms to bring you here," Ned said as he looked at her. "You carried me?" she asked softly. "I did, my lady. Are you well? Do you need anything? Some water, food?" he asked, and she shook her head at the offer of food, but did accept some water. He saw her eyes look to his back, and then she frowned, before she looked around the room and saw Dawn leaning against the wall. "Your sword is unusual, Lord Dane," she said. A moment later, and he found he quite enjoyed hearing her say his name. "Dawn, my lady, the sword of my house," he said, as he got up from his seat and walked over to it before removing it from its sheath. There had been many who looked upon Dawn with wonder, few who'd looked upon it and shed tears, and yet that was the woman did, and so he quickly sheathed it again. "Are you well, my lady, truly?" he asked, and she nodded. "I'm just tired, Lord Dane. Perhaps I could rest," she asked, and he told her that of course she could. "I'll leave you to your rest," he said softly. "Could you stay, my lord, until I sleep at least?" she asked, and he nodded. The call of the privy came just as night fell, and he was loath to leave her alone in the room. Watching her sleep, the rise and fall of her chest, and the small little noises she had made when she did so had been surprising comforting to him. He'd found the time to simply fly by and the hours to feel like mere moments. With a look to the bed, he moved quietly from the room and hurried to make water. Ned was gone for no more than a moment, but when he came back so was the woman from the bed, and he felt her loss most keenly. He'd not even gotten her name, and as he moved to pick up Dawn from where he let it, he saw a note attached to the scabbard. "To the Sword of the Morning, I am in your debt. Ray." Simple words in his mind went to the initial as he tried to imagine what the RAR stood for. Were it not for that then, perhaps his mind would have wondered how she'd known he was the Sword of the Morning. For he'd not told her such. Bravos 305 AC. Aegon. The meeting with the Faceless Men had gone as well as he'd expected, and Arya had told him that they truly had nothing to fear from them, which had come as a great relief. His sister had been uncomfortable with him going there, and while he was there, and he knew she'd seen how he'd taken it all in while they'd spoken in its halls. Arya had spent much too much of her life in that place, and it was still a part of her life they'd not spoken on. Aegon wasn't sure if it ever was going to be, and he knew she'd have preferred it if he'd never seen it for himself. Yet, it hadn't been for Arya. He'd gone there, though he was glad for her that he had. His visit had been to ensure the Faceless Men never threatened him or those he loved, and to take a weapon away from the Iron Bank's hand. It had been quicker than he'd expected, and so it was to the Sea Lord's palace and not the Iron Bank that Rosiel took them, and it was perhaps for that reason. It was nearly a fight they found themselves in. Well, that and an angered Tormund Giantsbane, when a man dared to raise a spear in his direction. "Put that down or I'll shove it up your fucking arse," Tormund said after they'd landed and guards had moved their way. "Tormund," he said, trying to calm the situation, and glad to see that while Yaime's hand was on his sword, it wasn't drawn just yet. "You've gone soft, King Crow. Look, there's only 20 of them. We can take them. You take the 9 and 10 over there, and I'll take this little one with the tight arse. Half the shaft, I reckon. Half I'll shove up his arse. And by the time you're done. Hash," Tormund said, laughing like a loon. He was relieved that Rhaegal at least was acting so nonchalant about it all. The green dragon was just lazing in the sun a few feet away from them, so whatever danger they may have been in was simply imagined and not real. Drogon flew high in the sky, and should he be needed then, he would be down to the ground in moments. And though he couldn't see Lyrex, he knew the red dragon was nearby. It was the feeling of him running to him, though, that brought a smile to his face, and whether it was Ghost or the man's voice that brought the spears down, he preferred to think it was the former. "I thought you weren't well," he said, kneeling down to rub Ghost's fur and looking in the wolf's eyes. "Hungry?" he asked, and received a lick from his tongue. "My king, my name is Larmo Farragon, the first sword of Bravos. The queen and the sea lord, as well as your other companions, await you inside." "You're the first sword, are you?" asked, stepping forward. "I am, my lady." "Did you know Syrio Foro?" she asked sadly. "I had the pleasure of being trained under him." Lormo said with a warm smile. "He was my friend," Arya said, and Ghost moved over to her and licked her hand. They walked into the palace, and Aegon chuckled when she saw the red dragon on the roof. He wagered that if he was standing where she was, then he'd be able to see Dany and Rhaella from whatever gap she'd found or made there. "A fine beast, my king," Lormo said, looking to Ghost. "Ghost is far more than a beast, Larmo. He and I would appreciate it if some food was provided to him. Cooked, I think." Aegon said to a nod from his wolf. "I shall see it's done, my king." When he entered the hall, it was to his wife and daughter. He went and he kissed them both. He looked to the food on the table and saw Brienne nod, and so he grabbed a little of the meat and fed it to Ghost. Before he then turned and whispered in his wife's ear, "See the hole in the roof?" Aegon whispered, and Dany nodded slightly. Lozir Lit's exact moment is looking down through that hole to make sure this little dragon is in no danger, he said as his hand brushed over Rhaella, and Dany smiled. The words that the Sea Lord said surprised him, while the Iron Bank refusing to meet them until the morrow did not. He welcomed the offer of rooms in the Sea Lord's palace, and that they were given ones with doors that opened out onto a private terrace. After washing, eating, and bidding their good nights to everyone, he and Dane took Rhaella out to Liar Hakes as she waited for them out on the terrace. Ghost had been fed well and seemed to much prefer the cold breeze of the night to the warm sun, and Arya had gone back to the ship to stay with Gendry, Lady Melora, and Lady Kinvara, among others. "You think his word's true, Aegon?" Dany asked as Loryx chirped at Rhaella, who he held in his arms. "I think he wishes to name you his queen and hopes that you'll keep Bravos as free and protected as one of your kingdoms." "Our kingdoms," she said, brushing her hand over Lagriax's scales. "Our kingdoms. I think he'd not have named me as king without you, which is something that endears the man to me more than anything," he said, trying not to laugh at the look on Rosiel's face as Laryex brushed against her. "Why?" Daddy asked before Yang shushed her for a moment to answer the red dragon who'd been chirping at him. I'll fly with you when you're bigger." I know I'm not your rider, but if you want her on your back, then you'll be taking me too," agreed. "Good," he said to Chirps, and a look from Dany, which he hoped his own back to her. Let her know he'd speak more on this later. "Why Aegon?" she asked when he'd gotten lost in thought. "Everyone should know it's both of us. Together. I have no wish to be king without you. Just as I know you don't want to be queen without me. Tormo understands that, and it's the breaker of chains he wants to kneel to, and not her husband. Though it'll be both us, he swears to," he said, and Dany leaned forward and kissed his cheek. They had told Tormo not to do so until after their meeting with the Iron Bank, and so after a good night's sleep and breaking their fast, he and Dainty made their way to the Iron Bank with Yaemi, Tormund, Dario, Brienne, and some Unsullied as their guards. Missandei stayed with Rhaella in the Sea Lord's palace, and Rhaegal, Yariex, Ghost, Jorah, Grey Worm, and Arya would all ensure their daughter's safety. Aegon wasn't surprised to see the building was a large and imposing one, nor that they were kept waiting even after they arrived. He even gave up his arms when asked, and chuckled when Tormund then took an age to give up his own. "For fuck's sake, King Crow, do you have any idea how long it takes to kill a man with your bare hands?" Tormund said as he handed over the last of his knives. "But they're so much tastier to eat fresh and unmarked, I find," he said to a loud laugh from his friend. "We'll need a fire," Tormund said with a huge grin on his face. "Plenty of that around here, old friend," he said, motioning to the sconces. Some of them do look tasty," Tormund said, licking his lips and winking at one of the more nervous of the guards. He and Dany were led into a room, and within moments of taking their seats, 3 men made their way in and sat opposite them. With a look to Dany, he saw her smile, and the roar that rang out almost shook the room, so loud was it. The sound of Drogon then landing outside was even louder, and Aegon smirked when Dany began to speak. "In case you think us unprotected," his wife said, and he welcomed the gulps from 2 of the men. "Now to business." He sat and listened as the bankers offered platitudes, spoke about how happy they were to have them both in their halls, and how much they looked forward to dealing with them in the future. Aegon trying his best not to yawn or sigh loudly, and instead focusing his attention on his wife. How Dany was able to look so interested at the dull words that were being spoken was beyond him and impressed him greatly. It was a talent he'd not been able to manage, this ability to look interested in things that didn't interest him. He knew that as a king, queen, lord, or lady, it was a talent that at times was most needed, but he'd found he'd little patience within himself to learn it. Which brings us to the matter of the debt. One of the bankers said, and Iak stopped his visual worshipping of his wife and got ready to listen to her speak, and to worship her in another way. The debt, Dany asked, that the crown owes to the Iron Bank, your grace, the weasel-faced man said as he looked to Aegon with an almost imploring look to get involved. I borrowed no coin for you, nor as far as I'm aware did my husband, Dany said, and Aegon tried not to chuckle. I believe I have remembered had I done so, Aegon said, and Dany smirked. The Iron Bank doesn't deal with kings or queens directly, your grace. We lend to the crown, and the crown only, and its debts carry forward, one of the other men said, and Aegon tried hard to remember his name. And you lent this coin to Cersei Lannister, did you not, Tycho? Dany said, and Aegon shook his head. He thought the man was called something much different, as she was who sat the Iron Throne. Your grace. My throne, my husband's throne, Tycho Nestoris. Well, I and my husband were fighting for said throne, and so by what right did you lend coin to our enemy? She was a usurper with no right to the throne, yet you lent her coin still, and now you wish for me to pay for it. Did Cersei pay Stannis Baratheon's debt, Tycho? Before you lent her coin, did she pay the coin you'd loaned to yet another usurper? Dany asked, and Aegon saw how the man moved back in his seat. Your grace, I asked a question, and I'd seek an answer, and an answer now. Dany said, not raising her voice, although given the loud roar that Drogon had just made, there was really no need to. I would need to check our books. A moment. Do so, and do so quickly, and if you can find it there, then you had better be able to show it to my husband and me, for your word means little to either of us. Dany said, and Aegon wanted nothing more than to sit back and enjoy the show. It had been Davos who told them of he and Stannis borrowing the coin. Stannis had agreed to add it to the debts that Robert Baratheon had piled up as king and to pay it when he came to the throne. When that was a key word and one his wife had picked up on. The Iron Bank may claim to support the crown, but they had supported Stannis and Cersei, two people who had no claim on it, with Dany's existence, and even less on it with his own. She did not. Your grace, Tycho said after a few moments. Usurpers everywhere, and behind them all was the Iron Bank. As wrong as your support for Robert Baratheon may have been, and especially from our own perspective, he at least had a true claim to the throne by right of conquest, if not blood, but his debts have been paid to you in full with coin from our kingdoms. Stannis Baratheon, Cersei Lannister, their debts died with them, and by all rights legal, moral, and practical, they are not ours to pay. The Iron Bank is not an enemy you wish to make, your grace, Tycho said warningly. Neither is my wife, Tycho, but feel free to continue along the lines you are, and we'll find out soon who is the most dangerous enemy to have, he said with a look on his face that dared them to do so. Are you aware of the Sea Lord's plans, Tycho? Dany said, and the banker turned his attention from him and then to his wife. Your grace, Tycho asked, confused. Braavos is to swear its allegiance to my husband and me. A kingdom in all but name. Have you any idea what happens to lords in our kingdoms that seek to defraud the crown and its people? Dany asked, and Aegon smirked. I can imagine, Tycho said with a gulp. Oh, there's no need for that, Tycho. In the north where my husband was raised, there is an old saying, the man who passes the sentence shall swing the sword. No doubt my husband's renown as a swordsman has reached even the ears of the Iron Bank, but I'll let you in on a little secret. Dany said, moving a little closer to the table, and Aegon was stunned when the three bankers moved closer too. The tales don't begin to do him justice. He listened to the cough and spluttering one of the men made as the other handed him a glass of water, while Tycho looked from him to Dany. With Braavos under our rule, the Iron Bank now serves at our pleasure. See to it that you never incur our displeasure. I look forward to working with the Iron Bank in the future. But I can so easily picture a future without them, and they wouldn't be the only bank that has fallen from grace. Tell me, Tycho, how are the Rawgurs faring these days? Dany said, rising to her feet. The debt will be written off, your grace, Tycho said, and Dany nodded as Aenya walked out of the room beside her. No sooner had they left the large room and then the iron bank itself than he picked her up off her feet and was kissing her deeply. By the gods, don't ever let me get on your bad side, he said to a laugh from her. I may not have a sword, Aegon Targaryen, but I am not defenseless, she said, smiling at him. Never, my love, he said, kissing her again. Daenerys, a voice called out, and Dany looked over his shoulder, forcing Aegon to let her down and turn around. Crosshair, Dany asked the strange woman that now stood in front of them, his wife holding her hand up so that Tormund, Brienne, and Jaime didn't stop the woman from moving closer to them. Not exactly, the woman said as she moved closer to him. Long have I wished to meet you, brother, the woman said as she took off her mask, and Aegon found himself face to face with a beautiful young woman with deep purple eyes. Brovos 305 AC. Rosiers. She stood at the docks and watched the dragons fly in the air. And then, as one of them landed, Rhaenys saw the man as he climbed up on the green one before it took to the sky. And she was no more than mere feet away from her brother when he did so. More than anything, she'd wanted to run to him, to stop him before he flew away, and though it was clear he'd be coming back, a part of her worried that he would not. When Daenerys walked by her holding her niece, the blood of her blood in her arms, Rhaenys had wanted to go to her too, but she could not. Now that they were here, she found that she was afraid. Would they accept her for who she was? Would they believe her? What proof did she really have? She closed her eyes and heard words that she'd spoken once to Daenerys, now being spoken back to her, and she welcomed them. The dragons know, do you? They knew. She could feel that they knew the truth of her, and if all else failed, then it would be with them that she sought to prove herself. After Daenerys and her niece had gone one way and Aegon another, Rhaenys went yet another. She walked around in a daze, almost, and were it not for the sight of the sword on the man's back, then she'd have continued to do so. The white blade, though, called out to her, and she had to find out if what she was seeing was what she had thought it to be. Seeing it up close, hearing the man say his name, it had been too much for her, and before she knew it was drifting and dreaming of another time and place. No Balerion, this way. Not in there. Where are you hiding? Art, have you seen Balerion? Here he is, princess. Thank you, Art. Say thank you, Balerion. A man with brighter purple eyes than her and her father had, but as close to her as her father had been, Sir Arthur Dane, the sword of the morning, and somehow his kin had now found her while carrying that very same sword. It had been too much, and it had taken a lot out of her. She'd found that she was comforted in his presence, though, and whether it was because he was Arthur's kin, or for some other reason, she cared not. It had been hard for her to sneak away, and she felt that if she stayed with Ned Dane, then he'd have brought her to Daenerys and Aegon anyway. But she needed to be with her egg, and so, after leaving a note, she snuck back to her rooms. She slept that night and dreamt of her brother's face. A face so much like her father's, and yet his coloring like hers was very much not. Rhaenys held her egg close to her chest, and when she woke the next morning, she knew that she could wait no longer. After following them both to the Iron Bank and waiting out in the sun, when she saw them walk from the building, her mind was already made up. Daenerys, she called out as Aegon spun their aunt around and placed kisses on her face. Quaid, Daenerys said as she moved forward and as her brother turned to look at her. His eyes were purple now, the same as hers were, and she smiled at that, as in all her dreams they'd always been gray. Their hair was the same, though his was curled like their father's, and her own was more straight, like her mother's had been. When she took off the mask, she heard the gasp from her aunt. Not exactly, she said, looking to Aegon. Long have I wished to meet you, brother, she said, and her arms went around him. He only held her for the briefest moment, and then she felt the black dragon when it landed. Rosienne turned away from Aegon and walked to the dragon before leaning out her hand to brush over its snout. The trill the dragon made was a true one, and she heard the footsteps and turned to see Aegon and Dany move to her. Then out of the corner of her eye she saw a man she'd not seen in 25 years. Who are you? Aegon asked, and there was no doubt or suspicion in those eyes that were the same as her one. There was recognition, and she believed there was hope too. My name is Rhaenys Targaryen. I'm your sister, Aegon, she said, and Drogon let out a noise that was a roar, but not one before. She then felt her brother's arms around her once more. Brevos 305 AC. Aegon. He could barely wrap his head around the fact that the woman sitting across from him was claiming to be his sister. Was that simply that then? He'd have been able to deny it and send her on her way. The problem was that he was absolutely certain that she was who she said she was. That somehow Rhaenys hadn't died in King's Landing all those years ago, and was now truly sitting in front of him. Dany sat beside him and held his hand in her own, and Ghost rested by Rhaenys' legs, and allowed her to rub his fur, the White Wolf having come to greet her as they made their way back to the rooms the Sea Lord had given them. For any other person, the idea of a long-dead sister being in front of them may have been too much to accept, and he could see that Dany was having difficulty doing just that. His wife wished it so for his sake and for her own, that much was clear to him. Yet, even after all they'd seen and faced, she was finding this to be almost a step too far. Some of that may have been because she'd met Rhaenys before, or to be more precise, had met a Rhaenys who was performing a mummery that she was no longer performing. Aegon knew without even looking at Dany's face that this was something she was still coming to terms with. The idea that she'd met family who'd lied to her only reinforcing the feeling within her that Rhaenys may be lying still. Aegon's soul had died not once, but twice. He'd lived a life that he lived no more, and had seen and done things that the gods had ensured would now never come to pass. So, the how or why of Rhaenys being here with them and his sister being alive was not as important to him as it should be. Instead, it was that she was here with them that he concentrated on. Family. He had more family, a sister of his blood and not just of his heart as he had in Arya. Someone who shared the same father as he did, and just as he had with Arya all those years earlier, he felt a bond with Rhaenys already that he'd not felt with many other people. "I know you have questions," Rhaenys said nervously. "Why are you here?" Dany asked more angrily than he would have wished her to. And Aegon saw Rhaenys stiffen. "Not that we're not happy you are," he said with a smile which seemed to put Rhaenys at ease, but made Dany grip his hand a little more tightly. "I could only meet you here at this time and in this place, otherwise I'd have come to you before now or left with you when we met." Rhaenys said, looking to him first and then to Dany. "So it was you I met?" Dany asked suspiciously. "It was Rhaenys said, smiling once more, and Aegon found himself unable to not look at that smile and feel its familiarity. "Why couldn't you leave with Dany, then?" he asked curiously, as Rhaenys stared at him almost sadly. Something she'd been doing since she had first sat down. "It wasn't the right time, and had I then all would have been lost." He looked from her to Dany and felt Dany grip his hand once more. The knock at the door startled all three of them, and he moved to it to find Ser Jorah was seeking Dany to let her know that Rhaella had woken. Exingen walked back in and spoke to his wife, who, with a kiss on his cheek and a look back at Rhaella had showed that she had not been won over as of yet, then left the room. Rhaella had seemed relaxed a little once his wife had left, and he felt that she'd been far more nervous, answering Dany's questions than she had or would his own. Something she confirmed to him a moment later. "I think she's having trouble understanding why I didn't tell her who I was," Rhaenys said, and Aegon nodded. "Why didn't you?" he asked, and he saw her relax. Even more. Aegon quickly realizing that his questions were curious, while Dany's were far more suspicious, and that's why Rhaenys was so nervous. "I couldn't. I wanted to. Gods, I wanted to. For so many years, I wanted to go to her or to you," Rhaenys said, her voice trailing off as she seemed to get lost in some memory or other. "You knew of me?" he asked, and she nodded, and he was stunned to see a tear fall from her eye, the first of many. "I'm sorry, Egg. Truly, Watching her struggle with her words was too much for him, and before he knew it, he was up and out of his chair, and holding her in his arms. The first embrace they'd shared was outside the Iron Bank, and he'd been so shocked and stunned by what she'd said that he barely knew what he was doing. This one was very much different. For the first time in his life, he now held his sister in his arms, and as he felt her lean into him, he wasn't sure if he could let her go. Rhaenys sobbed against his shoulder, and he rubbed his hand softly on her back as he held her tightly. I've got you, he said, not sure where the words had come from, and happy when he felt the sobbing stop and when she began to relax once more. Even after she had calmed, he didn't let her go. The two of them just standing there for the next few moments, locked in an embrace. Rhaenys too showed no signs of wanting to move away, and when he finally did move from her, it was to a smile from her when he held out his hand and led her to the couch. She sat down beside him, and he looked more closely at her face as he took her in once more. Her hair was as dark as his, and her skin was tanned like Ariane's. Yet it was her eyes that he found himself drawn to. Since he'd realized the truth about himself, his own eyes had begun to change. At times flickering from the dark gray they'd always been to a deep purple, as they were now. Looking into Rosie's eyes was like staring at his own in a looking glass. "Our father," she said, as she caught him looking. "What?" "Our eyes. We get them from our father," she said, and he smiled at that. Neither of them had got the Valyrian looks that Dany had, but he was happy to know they'd taken something from their father. Even more so, since he'd always been told he'd taken all he was from a man who was very much not. "How did you survive? Where have you been? Why didn't you—" Seeing and hearing her laugh, he did too. When she placed her finger to his mouth, Aegon shaking his head as he laughed and looked at her. "It's a very long story, brother," she said after they both stopped. "I'm going nowhere. Please, tell me it." "All of it?" he asked, and she nodded. "I will, but first, there's something I need to show you." Rosie said, and he watched as she got up from the couch and walked to a sack on the floor, one that he'd not even noticed she'd had in her possession. A moment later, she was sitting beside him again and holding a dragon's egg in her hands. It was a bright blue with specks of red, and when she nodded at him, he moved his hand to touch it. Exa felt it immediately, the dragon that was inside that yearned to be released. When he looked at her face, it was to see her staring at him with hope in her eyes. "It's alive," he said softly, and she smiled beamingly at him. "She is, and she's almost ready to hatch," Rosier said. A dragon rider. His sister was to be one just as he, Dany, and Ryaxa were, and for some reason, this pleased him most of all. He'd not given a thought to it in the short while since he'd met Rhaenys, but knowing that she too would fly through the skies made him feel even closer to her somehow. "This is why it had to be now, isn't it?" he asked as the thought came to his mind. "This is part of it, yes, but there is more, Aegon. More you need to know," she said worriedly. Tell me all of it," he said, and she nodded as she began to speak. 280 to 305 AC. A life lived? Rhaegar Targaryen, age 2 to 5. The noises scared her, and so she ran to where she'd not be frightened, only to find he was not there. Hiding under the bed, she closed her eyes and held her hands over her ears, willing the noises to go away. When she felt the hand on her leg pulling her from under the bed, she screamed and tried not to open her eyes. So scared was she of what she might see. Then she heard the voice, and it was soft and gentle, and it made her not feel scared anymore. "Mama," she said as she opened her eyes and looked into her mother's face. "Come with me, Rhaets. We must go," her mama said as she lifted her up into her arms. "Egg, mama," she said softly, only for her mama to shake her head. They were in the walls now, and the noises began to fade away, and Rhaenys began to feel tired as her mama carried her through the darkness. When it was that she fell asleep, she couldn't tell, but when she woke, her mama was gone, and she was in a room she had never been in before. "Mama," she cried out, only for a woman to move to her, and though she didn't know the woman, she looked like her grandmama, and so she wasn't scared. "Who are you?" she asked. "Where's Mama?" "Your mother. Can't come with us, child. As for who am I? My name is Shiera, and I'm your aunt. You and I are going on an adventure, and I promise you we'll have so much fun together." "Rhaenys," the woman said, smiling. And since she still felt tired, Rhaenys just nodded and lay back down to sleep. She was hungry when she woke up, and Shiera brought her something to eat and drink, and then told her that they were going far away, and that she'd not see her mama, papa, or Egg for some time. It made her sad, and she cried and cried as she pushed Shiera away, and even though she was hungry, the next day she refused to eat. The day after, she tried to do the same, telling Shiera that she'd not eat until she saw her mama, or her papa, or even Egg, even though he was only a babe still. "I'm afraid it'll be many years before you see them again, little one. So you must eat to stay strong for when you do," Shiera said. "No, I want my mama," she said, crossing her arms, only for it not to work with Shadow. How it did with those who were always around her. Hunger won out, and despite not wanting to, she ate when it was brought to her, and even took Shiera's hand when she led her onto the deck of the ship. She liked ships, and when she felt the sun and looked out on the water, she wondered if she was going to see her nuncles and cousins once more. It was this that comforted her, though she got bored with her time on the ship very quickly, and when it finally reached land, it was not to her nuncles she was brought. "We will stay here for some time. Little one, you may play with the other children, but don't tell them your name," Shiera said as she led her through the streets. Play she could play. For some reason, that was all she could think about as they walked, and so she didn't really notice the people or the place she was in that much. Later that day, she laughed as she and some other children chased each other outside the house where Shiera and she were to stay. When the children went away, she headed into the house to find a meal waiting for her that she ate, hungrily. This time, she even got a dessert, and that night Shiera tucked her up in bed and kissed her on the cheek. How long they stayed there was hard for her to know. But she did get bigger, and though at times she would cry when she thought about her mama, papa, and Egg, or when she saw a cat that wasn't Balerian, she laughed at times too with her new friends. So she was sad to say goodbye and to find herself on a ship again. And yet, she looked forward to wherever they were going, as she did the next time and the next time and the time after that, until the day of her 5th named day when Shiera told her that where they were going next would be very different from where they'd been to so far. We can no longer stay in the light, my little ray of sunshine. There are too many eyes upon us, and it is no longer safe for us to do so. The noises and those who make them head our way, Rhaenys, and we should not be here when they arrive. Shaena said, and Rhaenys shivered a little. Where are we to go, Auntie? She asked. Since the light is no longer safe for us, it's in the shadows that we must hide. Shiera said, and Rhaenys nodded, though she had no idea what it was. Her aunt meant. Asli Shay, Rhaenyra Targaryen, age 5 to 12. She'd been more scared than she had been even when she hid under her bed when they had first reached the Shadow City. It's people, how they looked at Shiera and her, and the darkness all combining to make her fear seem real. 2 days it had lasted for, and she was scared to even step outside. Then curiosity and boredom helped her overcome her fear. Shiera had been close to her those first few times she'd left their home. Then she'd begun to let her leave alone, and in time, Ashiya became just like any other place to her. Rhaenys played with other children. She took lessons and ate her meals with Shiera, and things moved on like that for days, weeks, moons, and even years. Over time, she forgot about her mama, papa, and Egg and the life she had before Shiera had come to take her away. At times, she would see glimpses of a man with silver hair and purple eyes and imagine him playing the harp, or a woman with dark hair who'd sing to her as she lay in her bed. She'd remember holding a babe in her arms while a woman held them both so that she didn't let the babe fall. But she couldn't remember who they were or why they were important. It was on her 8th named day that all changed, and she learned the horrible truth about the life she'd left behind and why it had been so important for her to do so. She'd been playing with her friends when one of them began to speak about how her mother now had her brother in her belly. Rhaenys and the other children not understanding until it was explained to her that her friend's mother was with child. That night, she dreamt of a dark-haired woman and of the babe she carried in her belly, and that had been like an opening of a door to a room that she'd not entered in a very long while. "Why can't I see him, Mama?" she asked. "Because your brother is not here yet, Raxley," her mother said, smiling at her. "When before dinner?" she asked, and her mother chuckled as she shook her head. "No, not then much later than that." "Later, I'm sleeping," she said, worried that she'd miss her brother when he got here. "Then I'll wake you, little dragon," she heard her father say as she jumped up from the chair and ran to him. "Papa," she said excitedly. "Were you speaking to Agrag?" her papa asked, and she looked at him confused. "Egg, Papa?" "Your brother, he'll be an egg, I'm sure," her papa said, and she giggled as she thought of her brother being an egg. She woke up crying and almost stormed into Shiera's room to find that her aunt was awake and was now looking at her worriedly. Rhaenyra asked, "I want to see my mama and papa, to see Egg. Take me to them. I want to see them now," she said determinedly, and only that she was angry and annoyed. She'd have noticed the sad look that Shiera gave her. "Come to me, child. Sit with me." She cried herself to sleep that night as she lay in the bed and refused to leave it when she woke on the morrow. For more than a week, other than to go to privy or to eat, she did nothing but lay in the bed and cry. Rhaenys knew now what the noises had been, and that it hadn't been her mother who had taken her from the Red Keep, but Shiera pretending to be her, when her aunt had shown her the face of her mother instead of her own. Rhaenys had almost wished to believe that was her true face, and it was the other that was the lie. It was not, and she hated her aunt a little for that. Though it was telling her the truth of things that she mainly hated her for. When she'd brought up that her father hadn't been in the Red Keep when the noises were made, it was far less of a victory than she had hoped it would be. Shiera quickly telling her that her father had met his own end somewhere else, and that she was now alone but for a brother that she didn't know. She'd asked to be taken to him only for Shiera to refuse, and so that it only angered her even more. For days she didn't speak to her when she brought her food or clean clothes, and she thought about running away only to find herself even more scared at the thoughts of being alone. It was almost a moon after she'd found out the truth that Shiera then spoke to her and told her something that changed her mood. "I can't bring your family back to you, Rosianes. That was not my purpose, and their lives were not in my power to save, only yours. I can only make you ready for what's to come, and to tell you that when you are, you'll have a family once more. One day you'll have a brother who will love you as much as you deserve to be loved. You'll have a different aunt than me who'll be like a sister to you, and a niece who you can spoil as much as you yourself deserved to be spoiled." Shiera said, "When?" she asked, feigning disinterest. "One day. I cannot say when, for true, as the future is unwritten, but I can say that if you're ready, then it will happen." Shiera said, and Rhaenys glared at her. "What do I need to do to be ready?" she asked. Her lessons were much different from then on. Lessons that were far harder for her to master, and even 3 and then 4 years from when she'd learned the truth of things, she'd still not mastered them all. Magic was a difficult thing to understand, and an even more difficult thing to control, and when she felt she'd gotten the hang of one thing, it would often prove to her that she very much had not. Shiera was full of magic, and people who were trying to learn it just as she was. Shiera told her there was more magic within her than there was in those here, and yet they seemed far more able to wield it than she. Rosie, aged 16 to 20. On the day of her 6th and 10th name day, Rhaenys found that there was a price for magic that always needed to be paid. She'd mastered some, if not all, of the lessons that Shatta had given her, and was able to glamour herself just as her aunt was, and able to see into the past and present in her dreams. And with the glass candles, though in both cases it was a hard and exhausting thing to do, and if she tried to look into the future, which she had done more than once, then the toll it took on her was even heavier. She'd been so busy with her lessons and her studies that she'd not paid much attention to her aunt. Had she then, she'd have noticed the lingering looks and the way she'd stay in the room for longer and longer each time. It was as if she was taking note of her more and more, and at night she'd almost will her not to go bed. Yet Rosier was oblivious to it, and it was only after she had left Ashii that she realized what it was that Shier had been doing. They had celebrated her name day, how they always did. The two of them sitting and eating their meal, Shiera then giving her a gift of some sort. And then her aunt would tell her tales of her father, mother, and both her brothers. He hid in the crypts and waited for his cousins to come along. And then once they did, Aegon jumped out and did his best to scare them. Shiera said, laughing as she spoke. "By jumping out at them?" Rosie asked, not quite seeing why this would be scary. Axelod was covered in flour. Rogier, to them he was a ghostly figure, one of the dead come back to life. Shiera said, and Rhaenys began to laugh as she pictured the scene. These were her favorite stories, the ones of her brother and her aunt. She loved stories of her father's childhood and those of her mother's, but they were tinged with far too much sadness for her to really enjoy, as were the ones of Egg, even though she was in some of those. The ones of Daenerys and Aegon, though, made her laugh, and she'd think of them as she lay in her bed at night. Imagining what it felt like for Daenerys as she played by the lemon tree, or what it was like for Aegon to spar with his oldest cousin, or tell tales to the youngest of them, she was on the verge of getting lost in those memories when Shiera stopped laughing and looked at her far more seriously than she had in some time. "You must leave this place, Rhaenys. Tonight, you and I must say our goodbyes." Scheherazade said, her voice almost cracking, such was her sadness. And yet, it was the expression on her face that Rhaenys concentrated on. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, as despite its strangeness, Ashe had been her home longer than anywhere else. "Not we, you. My journey ends where it was always supposed to, here in this place, and on this night." Shiera said, her voice barely heard. "Aunt, only death may pay for life, Rhaenys. That is the way of the world. And at least I bought something precious with mine own. The dragon must have 3 heads, and I've played my part, and I've stolen far too many years to seek any more." Sheerjer said, and Rhaenys looked at her and shook her head, tears falling from her eyes. "No, you can't. You can't. Please come with me, please," she said. And even feeling Shiera's arms around her didn't stop the tears from falling. She found out that her things had already been gathered and the ship was ready to take her away, and as she boarded it, she tried to keep her aunt's final words to her in her thoughts. It was hard to do as she heard the screams behind her as Shara was dragged away. They were the same noises that had made her hide under a bed as a young girl, and they were now ringing out once more. And so Rhaenys closed her eyes as the ship sailed away. "If I look back, I am lost," she said, repeating Shara's last words softly as the smoke from the stake they'd tied her aunt to wafted into the air. Langi, Yin, Karth, Meereen, Astapor, and Yunkai, onto Volantis and Lys, Tyrosh, Miri, Pentos, Bravos, Lorath, Norvos, and Kohar. For the next few years, she traveled to almost every city in Essos, and in each she sought out the same thing, answers. She sought answers to her past, to her present, and to her future, and found things that angered her, gave her hope, and scared her to her very core. Each city she visited had its own connection to magic, and yet not all the answers she found were magical in how they came to her. In Pentos and Bravos, the truth about what had happened to her family was finally revealed to her. How they had died and what had been done to them once they had, angering her greatly. Her mother had been raped and almost cut in two. Her brother's head was crushed after he'd been thrown against a wall by a monster. By comparison, her father's death was almost a welcome thing to hear, other than what it had led to. She heard how her grandfather was murdered by a knight that was sworn to guard his back, and how her grandmother had died birthing a child, her aunt. She found out she had another uncle too, and wondered why Shia had not mentioned Viserys to her, and that to all the realms she had died in her father's room that day. In lore, she'd learned about her other brother, and how he was being raised as a bastard by the Lord of the North, and it annoyed and angered her that a king was raised in such a way. Yet in her dreams, she'd seen him smile, seen him happy, and she'd laughed with him, even though she wasn't there by his side. So it was that she concentrated on and not the questions she had about Eddard Stark and his plans for Aegon. When she reached Norvos, she found herself drawn to the libraries, and using her glamour was able to come and go as she wished. Rosiane spending most of her time while there reading up on the tales of the Bloodstone Emperor and his reign of terror. It was when she reached Kedwar that the dreams truly began, and she saw things that she wasn't allowed to change or be a part of. When she saw Axuan fall, she had cried for days, and it was only when she saw him rise again that she was able to move forward. Rosiers looked on while her brother led an army as it marched through snow, and she was there as a silver-haired man was given a crown of gold. In each city, she'd feel the need to move on, and each time she did, then she'd leave immediately. Why it had to be that way. She knew not only that it did, and it was only when she found herself in Caris once more that things become clearer to her. By then she wasn't Rhaenys, or not truly at least. She was Querot with the Shadow, and when she saw her moving through the street, she knew that she had to speak the words. "Remember who you are, Daenerys. The dragons know." "Do you?" Quaitha said softly. Bravos 305 AC. Bien tip. Were it for any other reason than their daughter, then she'd not have left Aegon alone with Quaithe, Rhaenys, or whatever her name truly was. She knew that he believed her, that he so wanted to believe her, and only that the dragons seemed to know her and not fear her, that may have worried her some. Her husband had already been hurt terribly by one woman he'd thought of as a sister, and Dany wouldn't allow another the chance to do the same. So, as she walked to their rooms, it was with the strangest thoughts in her head, as she tried to remember if Sansa Stark had ever been close to the dragons. Those who the dragons trusted were allowed a certain closeness to them, not as much as she, Aegon, or Rhaeadel were, but they'd not be angered by their presence. For those who they did not trust, however, the dragons made their feelings clear, and should they get too close, then they'd be lucky if it was just their roars they'd face. As she entered her room to see Miss Md and Arya trying to placate a crying Rhaeadel, Dany was certain that Sansa Stark had never deigned to go anywhere near the dragons. Had she done so, then the girl would probably not be breathing now. She thought with a smirk. "Give her to me," she said as Miss Md did so with some relief in her expression. "Come, I'll take you to her," she said as she walked to the window, and as soon as she reached it, Lozierx changed direction and flew from where she'd been in the sky with Drogon and Rosiergal to land close to where she now stood with Rosiel. "I told you she wished for the dragon," Uriat said, and Dany giggled when Missandei stuck her tongue out at her good sister. Once she'd brought Rollo over so that she could stroke Liarax's scales, her daughter calmed immediately, and so after a few moments she turned and walked back into the room, and the red dragon flew back to her brothers. Taking a seat, she found Arya to be staring at her intently, and she knew what was on the girl's mind without her speaking it. Yes, she truly is Rangsi, she said, and was surprised to see Arya almost deflate. How? Arya asked as Missandei looked at her. I do not know. I'm sure she's telling Aegon as we speak, but considering Aegon himself has come back from the dead, is it really a surprise that so has his sister? She asked, and Arya shook her head. Your niece, Dany, Missandei said, and Dany smiled at that. Can she be trusted? Arya asked. A moment later, the dragons trust her, Arya. Ghost lay at her feet and let her rub her hands through his fur. Does he do that for everybody? She asked, and Arya shook her head. She was about to say something else when there was a knock on the door and Brienne stepped into the room with a letter in her hand. From the Sea Lord, Your Grace, Brienne said, and Dany motioned for her to give it to Missandei to read. He says he wishes to organize a coronation of sorts, to name you and his grace as Braavos' king and queen, and he pledges 30 ships and men to go with it to your cause. Missandei said with a smile. Does he say when he wishes to do this? She asked, and Missandei shook her head. As soon as you wish it, Your Grace. Missandei said, using her title, because Brienne was still present. Can you write him a response for me? Tell him we'll do so on the morrow, she said, and Missandei nodded and moved to grab some parchment and some ink. Once the letter was written and handed back to Brienne, Dany, Missandei, and Arya spoke on how long she expected to stay in Braavos and where they intended to go next. They and the Dornish would soon be splitting their forces as they sailed to Meereen, and Arianne went to her mother in Norvos. Now that they had the Sea Lord on their side, this would be even easier, as Arianne would have an escort of sorts, and should they need their help, then the dragons would soon take her and Arianne to join them. For Dany, it was the thoughts of seeing Meereen again, of showing it to Aegon and to Ryaka and freeing her people that gave her a sense of urgency. It had been that which had fueled her when she dealt with the bankers and told them the truth of their situation. She and Aegon had considered stopping in Volantis to deal with Bellico right away, and Arianne and Ned Dane had suggested they go to Norvos, since it was closer, but her people were back in chains and she would see them free once more. She smiled when Jamesry came by to speak to and check up on Arianne, and though Aegon didn't join them for lunch, she found herself unworried. It wasn't until later that evening that he did come back to the room, and she was happy to see that he was in such a good mood, with a kiss to her cheek and a quick check on Rosia, who lay sleeping in her crib. Aegon then took a seat, and she watched as he poured himself a large mug water, which he drank down quickly. All is well? She asked as she sat beside him. I've asked Rhiannon and some of the Unsullied to take Rhiannon back to her room to get her things and bring them here, and she'll join us for dinner later on, once she's settled. Aegon said almost cheerfully. She's truly your sister? She asked, even though she hadn't really any doubts. She is Dany, Yaxon, smiling. Gods, I thought my life, or yours, was hard, and they were, but hers was in some ways worse. How so? She asked, curiously. She was taken from the Red Keep just as her mother and my brother were being killed. Taken from all she knew, and for the first few years she believed they lived only to then find out the truth. Then, as she grew, she found out even more about that truth, and about us, only to not be allowed to come to us, to be with us. Allowed by who? Aegon. Ushira's Sea Star, Egane said, and though the name was familiar, it also wasn't. Our great aunt many times removed. She was the lover of Bloodraven. The three-eyed raven? She asked worriedly. Aye. I think they were trying to prepare us for what was to come. Bloodraven and Shiara. I think they were working together, him in Westeros and Shiara in Essos. My father knew. Maybe not all of it, but he knew. The dragon must have 3 heads. You, me, and Rhaenys, it was always meant to be, but not all wished it so. Aegon said, and she looked at him in confusion. Is he Aegon? She asked, and he leaned forward and smiled at her before he kissed her lips softly. I know it's hard to understand. Gods, I've spent most of the day speaking with her. And even Rhaenys doesn't truly understand it, but I think I do. As odd and strange as it may sound, I think I finally do. Aegon said, smiling again. Tell me, she said, and he shook his head. I will. I'll tell you it all, but for now, let us just enjoy the fact I have another sister and you another niece. Let's us take comfort that there is more of our family alive, and that Rosia now has an aunt, another one. Aegon said, and she nodded, accepting that as being enough for now. Dinner that night was both uncomfortable and very much not at the same time. Arya seemed a little put out that Aegon was speaking to Rhaenys more so than to anyone else, but Dany could understand. The reason for that, it wasn't just that he'd found a sister he believed to be dead, but Rhaenys herself seemed more than keen to speak to him. She was far more comfortable doing so than she was with any of them, including her. Other than Razia, that was, as at one point when they'd finished eating and Rogia had woken, Aegon had held her and then allowed Rhaenys to do the same. The look on her face was one of almost pure joy, and Dany felt herself relax more around Rhaenys from that point on. No one who looked at a babe that way could ever be a danger to that babe, and even Rogia seemed to relax a little after that. When they were finished eating, she looked on as Aegon spoke softly to Arya, and then after the others who'd eaten with them had gone, it was just her, Aegon, Rhaenys, and Rhaenys. How do you not just hold her in your arms always, Aeg? Rhaenys asked, and Dany chuckled upon hearing her call her husband that. Were I not so fearful of my wife's anger, then I probably would, Rosia, Aegon said. She's so precious, so perfect, Rhaenys said, and now I have another person to fight with for her attention. Yaxon said with a smirk as Rhaenys giggled while she played with Rhaena, who was laughing too. Dany sat and watched them speak to each other as if they had been together all their lives and hadn't just met that day. There was a comfort between them that she'd rarely seen Aegon have with anyone other than family. With Arya, it had taken time for that comfort to be shown, given his doubts about his sister's loyalty, but once those doubts had been cleared up, then this was how they acted together. She had never seen him that way with Sansa, and their own interactions were different still, and she wondered how he'd been able to accept Rhaenys so quickly. Was it their shared blood? That it was more than it was with Arya and Sansa? The true blood of a sister and their shared dragon blood, allowing for the connection to be formed so quickly, or was it simply he had a hole in his heart that only Rhaenys could fill? Her husband cared greatly about family. It was why Sansa's betrayal had hurt him as deeply as it had. Was he seeking something to fill the hole that betrayal had left behind? She hoped it was more than that, but as she looked at Aegon, Rhaenys, and Rhea, she found herself hoping for other things too. Brevos 305 AC. Melora? From the moment they'd landed here, she'd reached out and found the lands to be much different than those they'd left. There were no weirwood trees in Essos, and so she instead found that she could see through the eyes of the birds that flew over these lands. She had kept to her room and reached out, and for a day or more she had flown. How many minds she'd opened she knew not. 50, 100 more, she couldn't tell, only that there were many. Loreth, Norvos, Ko, Hor. She'd looked down on each of them as she had Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. She'd taken birds, mice, cats, dogs, and even a small long-tailed monkey in Volantis. Though it would only do her will partly, Melora had watched as the girl had gone to Aegon and Daenerys, and she had felt the power almost come off her, in waves. It was an odd thing to feel, and something she had only felt with Daenerys, Aegon, or Roe, up to then. Whether that was because of their shared blood, she couldn't tell at first, but Kinvara seemed to think it was far more than that. Those three are as one, and all three it will take to bring him down, Kinvara said after she'd interrupted Melora's warging. She has no dragon, surely Rhaella is the third, she said, and Kinvara shook her head. The princess has a different fate and an empire to rule over. The king, the queen, and his sister, they are the three heads, or the dragon of this I am certain. And what of her mount? She asked, as Kinvara smiled. She shall be here soon as well. She met Rhaenys Targaryen properly the next day, for the first time, and standing in her presence she could feel the power even more truly. It wasn't the same as that which came from Daenerys or Aegon, and her magics were different from theirs. Again Kinvara offering up answers to questions that she'd not asked. She's touched the shadow, Kinvara whispered as they made their way to the moon pool and the awaiting Sea Lord and First Sword. Has she asked, and saw Kinvara's nod. Today there was an even bigger crowd surrounding the moon pool than normal, and she could see how many of them were the true power behind Bravos. To the left of the Soxlyard stood men she knew were the key holders of the Iron Bank, and beside them were the most powerful of the merchants, religious leaders, and even a man who she knew wore a face that was not his own. Aegon and Daenerys had brought a large guard with them, and the dragons were close by, while Ghost stood by Missing Dai's side as she held Rhaeadala in her hands. We are here today to do something Bravos has never done before. We do this not just because the threat that comes our way is one we cannot face alone, but because we all know the truth of House Targaryen and those who lead it now. They are not what they once were, and it is that which allows for them to be who they are now. I ask you to take to your knees and to welcome the King and Queen of Braavos, Aegon, and Daenerys Targaryen. The Sea Lord said, and she looked on as Kinvara moved when they did. Rise, good men and women of Braavos, for you do not belong on your knees. Daenerys said, and Melora looked to see smiles on most of the faces. Most of you have heard the tale of my wife, of how she broke the chains and burned the collars of those that were enslaved in the Bay of Dragons. Aegon said loudly, Masula, breaker of chains. She smiled as she heard them chant the words, and at how those who had been with Daenerys for the longest seemed to stand a little straighter now. Our enemy has not only placed those collars back around the necks of free men and women, but seeks to do so to each and every person in Essos, and so my wife has returned to finish what she started all those years ago. Akazan said, looking to Daenerys and nodding as he climbed into the moon pool. This time I will not stop at the Bay of Dragons, nor will I let anything divert me from what needs to be done. Just like Braavos, all of Essos will be free. Every man, woman, and child will grow up in a world where there are no collars, there are no chains, and there are no slaves. Daenerys said to loud cheers as she too stepped into the moon pool. The cheers hushed as Kinvara stepped forward, and as both Aegon and Daenerys knelt down and placed their heads under the water. From out of the darkness comes the light, Kinvara said, and she and all of those present had to shield their eyes when Aegon unsheathed Lightbringer and the sword glowed and the water in the pool shined. She heard the roar of the dragons, and then the light faded as Aegon helped Daenerys out of the pool. When she saw Runchase move forward, she was surprised to see her carry a dragon's egg in her hand. More so when she placed it in front of Aegon and then cut her hand with a small knife that Kinvara handed to her. Then Daenerys did the same as did Aegon, and soon she was having to shield her eyes once more, as Lightbringer was unsheathed once again. Melora felt it was different this time. Its light was not as bright, and yet it felt even more powerful to her. Soon enough, her eyes adjusted, and she was able to look as Aegon raised the sword and brought it down on the dragon egg. The crack was loud, and so were the roars of the three dragons in the sky, and yet she and everyone else heard the small screech that the blue dragon made as it was lifted into the air by Runchase. The liberation of Meereen 3006. Diadio. In the past few weeks, he'd seen a princess who everyone had thought long dead somehow be proved to be alive, and he'd watched as a dragon was born. Was that not enough for him to be sure he was dealing with powers beyond his understanding? Then looking at the blue baby dragon would be, she was already as big as Lycaerx, only a few weeks old, and she was already larger than a horse. Dalier remembered the queen's dragons, and though they grew quickly, even they hadn't grown as quickly as this one. He had heard people speak about how it was, because there were now more dragons in the world, and that somehow this was the reason, but he didn't believe that to be the case. Instead, he was certain it was because of those who rode the dragons, who had brought them back in the world, and loath though he had once been to admit it, because of the king. Aegon Targaryen was not who he had expected him to be, and he had found that he actually liked the man. He was jealous of him still, but he liked the man, and for once that was enough for him to put his jealousy aside. She was not to be his, that much was clear, and seeing her with another man still hurt him somewhat. It at times made him feel as if he was Mormont and Aegon was him, and yet it was much different. Daenerys had never smiled that way with him, she'd never looked at him that way, and seeing her, Aegon, and their daughter was like looking at a life he never could have had, and never would have wished for. He had wanted her, only her. And his love was a far more selfish kind. Daario knew that he'd never have been able to share her love with another, even if that other was a child. Aegon, though, seemed to take no issue with not always being the focus of her attention, and, if anything, he seemed just as pleased when it was their daughter, and not he, that Daenerys looking at. Were it him, then he'd have needed to do something to bring her eyes to him. Where Aegon, he did not. The man was an enigma to him, at times, and none more so than when he'd asked for his permission to serve the queen and himself. "You wish to speak to me?" "Aegon." "You are unarmed," he said, surprised. "Is there a need for me to be any other way?" Aegon asked, and Daario shook his head. "At one point, perhaps, but not now," he said, and Aegon looked at him and said nothing. "You know how I feel about the queen," he said, deciding to be truthful. "I know, I came here hoping to win her back, thinking I would." Even when I saw she was with another, I cared not. I planned your death many times since I've been here, he said, looking at Aegon, who seemed not to be disturbed in the least by his words. Yet I breathe still. Yet you breathe still, he said, with a small chuckle. Your performance in the sparring yard gave me pause, the Queen's words gave me pause, and seeing you both with your daughter made me realize that even could I kill you, it would do me no good. Daario said, and Aegon again didn't even seem to blink at what he'd said, and he wondered if he was thinking about or planning what to do with him. My wife is a remarkable woman. I know that far better than anyone. I also know that Jorah Mormont loved her once. He loves her still, and yet he guards her back and mine own, and there is no one my wife trusts more to do so. Tormund is my truest friend. A brother to me in all but name, and yet we were enemies once, and he would have seen me dead if it had come to that. He looked at Aegon and saw a small smile on his face, and he wondered what it was he was thinking about that had put it there. We find our true friends on the battlefield to Daario Naharis. And what is a truer battle than the one we've both fought on? What is a truer battle than the one fought for love? Aegon said, and Daario nodded. I wish to serve my queen and her king, to guard their backs, and see them safe and kept from harm. We are not friends, you and I, and you are not my king. Not today. But who knows what the morrow will bring, and that it won't find me on my knees as I name you both. Daario said, and he caught the chuckle that the king made. Good, now I can call my wolf off. Aegon said, and as he turned around, he saw the red eyes, and he laughed. Aegon was not as unarmed as he had thought him to be. He looked at the walls of the city in the distance and watched as the ships began to head to land. Some would sail on and take the docks, and the army would march and surround the city, and he found himself looking forward to the battles to come. Daario had fled this city, but with a purpose, and he had thought when he came back it would be by his queen's side. Partly this was true, though it was also not how he had envisioned it. Perhaps this was the only way it could be, though, and if so, then so be it. His time with Daenerys was over, in that way, at least. Now it was time for him to be with her in another... Jaime! He hadn't been able to speak to her, the words not coming to him, and so he'd avoided her as much as he could. Ogain told him that he'd spoken to Rhaenys about him, and that his sister didn't blame him for what happened to their brother or her mother, and that she was as grateful as he was for what he'd done to their grandfather. Yet still, he couldn't speak to her and could barely even look her way. It was why today was so much harder for him, as he was told to stay by her and Rhaenys' side along with Jorah and Brienne. Protect my family, Ser Jaime. Guard them as you've guarded me, Aegon said. The words were so much like those his father had said to him so many years before, and he'd felt his chest tighten and his breathing became more stilted after Aegon had left on Rhaegal's back. They weren't docked and had more than a dozen ships close to them. Lujur, Aegir, Axe, and Reichin, that she'd named for mother and father both, were on the deck of the ship, and they had more than 200 unsullied and ghost with them, too. Rosier, Gendry, and 200 more of their men were on the ship nearest to them, and all in all, there were perhaps 2,000 men ready to protect the two princesses with their lives. Not that any of them expected an attack to come, as both Lady Kinvora and Lady Melora had said, the victory won today would be swift and decisive, and by nightfall they'd be in the Great Pyramid itself. Yavi was happy to be standing outside the door of the cabin with Jorah, while inside Brienne and Ghost waited just in case. Should anyone be lucky to make it as far as them, then the White Wolf and the fiercest woman he'd ever known would see to their ends. He knew that, like him, Jorah wished to be elsewhere, though for different reasons. Not that he wasn't worried about the king and queen's safety, just that it was lesser on his list of concerns for the day. Aegon and Daenerys would be on their dragons, and up there they were as safe as they could be. So he stood. He waited and hoped the fight was as easy as Lady Melora and Lady Kinvara said it would be, and that he'd find the courage to speak to Rhaenys sooner rather than later. Tormund. He could ride a horse as well as any other than these men, that was. The horse lords were like Jon up on the dragon and far more comfortable than he. They'd ridden to the gate of this city in far too quick a time, and he'd barely been able to keep up. Unlike him, they'd been more comfortable with the weather in this God's forsaken place, too. Tormund was sure that this was a hell on earth, as it made Dorne feel as if he was back beyond the wall. His furs were a thing of the past, and though he'd never speak it out so anyone could hear, especially Jon Snow, the clothes he wore were a welcome respite from the heat of the sun. That they were so brightly colored was even something he was starting to enjoy. The yellows especially garnered him some appreciative looks from some of the Dothraki women he'd found. It was how his friend would look at him as he was dressed in his fewer black, though that was starting to annoy. So Tormund had resolved to get the Dragon Queen to make the little crow wear something colorful before this war was done. "What are we waiting for?" he asked, when Jukono rode his way. "Dragons," Ho said. And Tormund smiled at that. A little way down from where he and those around him waited for their signal, he could see more and more of the Dothraki. They had practically surrounded this city, and he wondered what those inside its walls were thinking. Whatever it was they'd be thinking, something else now, and he smiled when he heard the dragon's roars and looked to the sky to see them flying overhead. As they passed over them, the horde, the Khalasar, began to ride as one, and he was moving before he knew it. He heard the cheers as the dragon's flames were seen. The queen's mighty beast, taking care of the archers on the walls, while Jon took his own dragon to clear their path before them. By the time they reached the gates, they'd been burned away to ash, and a moment later they were in the city, and he was swinging his sword at some fool with a spear who'd not learned how to run. Ahead of him, the dragons were flying towards the sea, and though men tried to stop their charge, they were no match for him and the Dothraki, while they were a horse. Arrows flew, Araxalai swung, men fell, and through it all he swung his sword one way and then the other. On and on they rode, and those who weren't cut down by the sword, Araxalai Surero, soon fell to the horses' hooves as they were simply ridden over, and Tormund reveled in it. How he wished they'd had these men with them when he had marched with Mance. Had they been then, his friend would live still, and more of his people would have survived, rather than been cut down by men unworthy to name themselves as kings. He followed a worthy one, and as they reached the end of their ride, his eyes were drawn to the sky to find him and his dragon queen. Grey Worm. His men were ready, and lined up as the ships moved to the docks. He would lead the first 200, and behind him some of his men held the gangplanks ready. They came under attack as they moved closer to the docks, flaming arrows and scorpion bolts, and whether the men they faced had bad aims, or the gods were truly with them, they did little damage. He smiled when he heard the sound of the dragon's roars in the distances, and then when he saw the flames hit the men who had fired upon them. One sweep of the dragons was all it took, and yet, after his king and queen had flown over their heads, both Drogon and Rhaegal were brought back in once again. This time they didn't lay their flames down. Instead, both dragons just roared even more loudly, and then Grey Worm and his men were then running down the gangplanks with spears in hand. His own didn't even taste blood, as most of the men they faced were either dead or already beaten, and once he knew the docks belonged to them, he ordered the rest of their men to disembark. After he had done so for 6 ships, he knew it was time. Taking almost 1,000 men and leaving 200 to guard the docks while the rest of their forces were landed, Grey Worm led the men through the streets and ready to face whatever came his way. He wasn't surprised that men hid and tried to ambush them, and those who did so were shown no mercy. Soon enough, they joined up with the Dothraki, and now the real work would begin. The pyramids would be where most of the men would be waiting for them, and they'd think themselves safe there. But Grey Worm knew they were very much not. "Should we proceed?" Redfleet asked. "We wait for the king and queen," he said, and Redfleet nodded. They didn't have long to wait as the dragons landed in front of them, and Aegon and Daenerys climbed down of their backs unharmed and unhurt. Jukono and Tormund moved from their men to the king and queen's side, and he watched as Aegon looked to the great pyramid and at the others with an odd look on his face, while his queen, who'd seen them before, did not. "Send word for a parley," his queen said, and Grey Worm called for 2 of his men to bring the word to the men inside. This time their wait was a long one, and he worried about the men he had sent, as he knew that the masters never saw them as anything other than tools to be used. It would be just like them to kill those men and think they were sending a message, though if they did so, they'd find the message sent back was not one they expected. Finally, after more than 2 hours, the men came out. 3 fat masters who had once ran this city, and 1 large man who was perhaps the leader of their men. He could see the contempt on the masters' faces, and yet there was worry there too, when they saw just how large the dragons were, and the sheer number of men they had with them. Still, these were cocky, arrogant men, and their arrogance was soon on show as they spoke in Valyrian to the king and queen. "You have no right to be here in our city. Go with your lives." A fat master said, "We have hostages, women, and children, and we will send you their heads each hour that you don't leave." Another said, "We have powerful friends, and this outrage will be answered," the last of them said, and Grey Worm watched alertly as his queen moved forward. "I let you all live once before, and swore to you what would be done should you defy my will. Yet here you are now in my city enslaving my people once more. And you dare to threaten me and to threaten those under my protection? So be it. Let today's message ring out loud and clear, Aegon, his queen said. And Grey Worm watched as Aegon drew his sword, black fire now in his hand, and then he moved like the wind. The leader of the men was first. A slash from his right shoulder to his left hip that opened him and spilled his guts to the ground. Then one of the Fat Masters lost his head in the blink of an eye, as did another, until the last fell to his feet and soiled himself as he wept and begged for his life. Order your men to stand down, and you live to see another sunrise. Do not, and your death will be far more painful than that of your friends. My husband will cut you apart piece by piece, and we will keep you alive so you can watch as our dragons eat you, limb by limb, his queen said, and the sound of the man's weeping grew louder as Aegon looked down at him and raised his sword. Please, please, I'll do as you say. Don't kill me, don't feed me to your dragons. By the time night had fallen, the only men in Meereen who were armed were sworn to his king and queen, and the ship carrying the princess and Aegon's sister had landed, as had the one carrying his other sister and the one with Lady Melora, Kinvara, and Missandei. He now stood in a hall that he had not seen for more years than he could remember, and he watched as his queen sat her throne and as she held the princess in her arms. Aegon stood on one side of the throne and his sister on the other, while he, Jorah, Brienne, Jaime, and Daario stood guard on the steps as the doors were opened and the people were led into the throne room. You are in the presence of their graces, Queen Daenerys and King Aegon Targaryen, the king and queen of Meereen, the Khal and Khawasi of the Great Grass Sea, the mother and father of dragons, the breaker of chains, the unburnt and the resurrected, Missandei said, and Grey Worm smiled. They were where they were supposed to be at last. Meereen 3006 AC. Dany, she woke up and for a moment didn't know where she was, as it was their first night in these rooms. The day before she'd had the bed removed and a new one brought in, even though she wasn't and couldn't be sure it was the same one that she'd slept in previously. She'd not take the chance. Either one would never have known, and perhaps he'd never have brought it up to her. Yet for Dany, it was that she would, and she didn't want to sully what she and Aegon had by sharing the same bed with him that she had once shared with another. So their first night in Meereen had been spent not in the same rooms she'd once called her own, but in ones on a different level of the Great Pyramid. Were it not for the dragons, then she'd perhaps have not even sought to use the same rooms, but the simple truth was it was far better for her. Aegon and Rhaella to be closer to the sky than not. Dragon and Rhaegal were far too large for the terrace. But Leorix had already made a home for herself out there, as had Rhaegal, Azalite, Blue Dragon on Balerion. Dorothy had been confused at first over the name, and it wasn't until Aegon explained it to her that she truly understood Rhaex's reasons for naming a blue dragon after a black one. When she was a girl, she had a cat named Balerion. The Black Dread, she and others dubbed it. I think she wishes to feel that again, that connection. And this time she'll have it with something that can protect her when those who were supposed to, Aegon said. The last bit slightly bitterly. Egg, she said softly, and he chuckled as he shook his head. Not you two, he said, though his smile showed he quite liked the name. She turned over in the bed and looked at her husband as he slept, his face so calm and his expression one she'd come to enjoy staring at. He was so very different from the man who had come to Dragonstone more than a year ago. Then he had been sullen, hidden, withdrawn, and his emotions were almost impossible for her to read. Now he was far more open, around her and Rhaella, almost completely so, and even with others there were times when she'd see him be the same. With Arya, Tormund, and surprisingly with Jaime Lannister too, and with Rhaenys now as well. For Dany that was still a work in progress, and while she was getting closer with her niece, there was still a distance between them that she and Aegon didn't have. There were things about his sister that he knew and she did not, and though he'd promised to share them with her, they'd simply not had the time to do so yet. Miri needed to be righted, and she'd found out that some of her most loyal people had lost their lives because of how they'd felt about her. It angered her as much as it saddened her, and yet it was the former she concentrated on. When they finally moved against Bellico himself, she would make him suffer as he had made her people suffer. Dany, Yakon said, waking, and she chuckled as she kissed his cheek. I do so enjoy being the first thing my husband thinks of when he wakes, she said, smiling. Still, and then she laughed fully at Akon's response. I was going to say you're pressing down on my chest, and could you please move? Aegon said. and she slapped him softly, as she laughed. He rose from the bed and made put on his small clothes before making his way to Raxiak's crib. Their daughter slept peacefully, and Daxi lay in the bed watching him as he looked down at her. After a few moments, he walked back to the bed and climbed back in. The look on his face one she'd not seen him wear for the longest time, and it reminded her once again of the man who'd come to treat with her on Dragonstone. "Okay?" she asked worriedly. "There are things we need to talk about, Dainty. Things I've put off speaking to you about because I didn't know how or even if I should. Things that Rainseas has told me too, that doesn't worry me, but those we can speak on after I tell you the truth." Reimagined said, not looking at her. "The truth?" she asked softly. "I've told you some about the visions I had. The one on the ship as we sailed to White Harbor and the others since. You remember the one I spoke of in Winterfell when Jaime had to drag me from the pond?" he asked, and she nodded before she answered him. When she saw he was still looking anywhere but at her. "I remember," she said, and he looked at her now, his expression one of such intense sadness that it made her choke up to see him that way. "I," again said, his words barely coming from his mouth. "Yakin, please speak to me," she said as she moved her hands to his face and turned it so he was looking directly at her. "I killed you, Dany. I killed you because I was too much of a coward and fool to do what needed to be done. I chose them over you, and then I killed you for them. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," Aegon said as he began to sob. As much as she wished to offer comfort to the man she loved, she found she could not. His words made no sense, and yet they filled her with such dread that she found herself unable to move. The silence of the room was only broken by the sounds of Aegon's crying and by the deep breaths that she was taking. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head after she'd composed herself enough to speak. "Aegon, I don't—" Her words were interrupted by his own, and she listened as he told her a tale that soon had her in tears as well. Aegon spoke of a very different arrival at Winterfell, and of her being left to face a hostile North alone. A hateful Sansa Stark who did all she could to undermine her in the minds of the Northmen, and a weak and silent Aegon who stood by while she did so. That he didn't dare come up with an excuse for why he'd been so weak was perhaps part of the reason that she didn't lose her mind or her temper as he told his tale. Instead, she listened on in horror as he painted a picture that she found she could see as vividly as if she was living it. A gap forming between them and one that was manipulated by those around them, then a battle fought not together, but as two almost separate forces. Losses after losses that sent her spiraling into despair, and the one person who may have been able to pull her from that pit, just standing idly by and saying nothing. She bit down on her hand as she was told that Ser Jorah and most of her men had fallen. As she then learned that Rosiel had been taken from her by Euron Greyjoy, and to a loud sob she was told that Missandei was killed by Cersei Lannister. Was that not bad enough? She was then told that Varys had worked against her to put Aegon on the throne, that Tyrion betrayed her for his brother, and then worst of all she was told what had happened in King's Landing. "You were lost, Dany. I was too, but I should have found you and brought you back. What you did, it wasn't you, Dany. It was never you. They made you do that. They made you into what you were not, and then was that not enough? I allowed them to use me to take you from this world." Aegon said, his voice showing his anger now too, which at least she could respect if not forgive. "Get out," she said as she pushed him from the bed when he was finished speaking. "Get out, get out, get out," she said over and over again, her tears falling freely now. "Dany, get out," she shouted, as she beat her hands against his chest over and over, and how it didn't wake Rhaella, only the gods knew. "No," he said, and so she slapped his face, once, twice, 3 times. She didn't hear the door open or see Jorah and Brienne step into the room. Her eyes were on Aegon's face, and the red mark she'd put on it, and still she slapped him, though this time on his arms and shoulders. "Leave us." Aegon shouted to the guards who looked from him to her. "Leave us now," he shouted, and never had she heard him use such a tone. Though it wasn't his words that forced them from the room, but Ghost who snarled at them, both, and Dany didn't hear the door close behind them after they had gone. "Get out, Aegon. Go, leave me. I don't want you here," she said as he dropped his hands and offered her many more targets to take her anger out on. "No, I did that once before. I'll not do it again. Strike me, beat me, hate me all you wish, but I'm here, Dany, and here I'll stay." She glared at him and then heard Rasleo cry as she woke, which forced her from the bed and to her daughter's side. Leaning down, she took her in her arms, and felt some of her anger recede, though it returned when she looked at her husband as he sat in their bed. Ruslia was hungry, and so she fed her before putting her back in her crib, her daughter falling right back to sleep, and Daddy left alone with Aegon, who'd not moved while she'd done so. "How am I supposed to forgive you for what you did?" she asked angrily. "You're not. I've not. I'll never forgive myself for it. I lived a full life after I'd taken your own, a life full of misery and regrets. For more than 50 years, not a day went by where I didn't hate myself for what I had done or call out to the gods to take me from this world." Aegon said softly, "And that makes it better," she said dismissively. "No, being given a second chance makes it better," he said, looking at her. "That man is dead, Dany. He died the same day you did in the throne room. He died the first night we lay together on the ship to White Harbor." Aegon said, his voice firmer now. "How can I know that? How can I trust you?" she asked, worriedly. The thoughts that she'd never be able to trust or believe him again threatening to overwhelm her. Jon Snow was a wolf. Dany. He lived a life as a wolf, and he died a wolf. My name is Aegon Targaryen, and I am a dragon. When my time is done, I will die as dragon. That's how you know. She looked at him and wanted so much to believe him. She needed to believe him, as the thoughts of not having him in her and Rhaenyra's life were too much to even consider. All the things he'd done in one life, he'd corrected and done differently in this one. He had been a wolf and put his pack before her, and it had them down a road filled with tragedy and remorse. As a dragon, the road he'd led her down was filled with happiness and love and had brought her the thing she wished for most in the world. A babe of her own. "Never keep anything from me again, Aegon. Nothing. Not one thing, even if you believe it's for the best. I do not know. Promise me this. Or leave Rhaenyra and me and never come back. Promise me this, and should you not live up to your promise, then I'll never forgive you," she said, as he climbed from the bed and moved to her. "I promise, Dany. I promise with all I am," he said, and she looked at him and could see it in his eyes that he was speaking the truth. "Tell me the rest of it," she said, and he nodded. Mirren 306 AC. Rosie's. She arrived in the middle of an argument and to worried looks from the two dragon guards at the door to her brother and aunt's room. Looking to Ser Jorah and Ser Brienne and listening to the loud and angered voice of her aunt, she was torn between going inside and not, or speaking to the worried guards. The decision ended up being taken out of her hands as the two guards looked at each other and walked inside, and then she heard Aegon ordering them to leave. Why she hadn't walked into the room with them, she wasn't sure, but a part of her felt that it wasn't her place to intervene, even if she felt she should. After a few moments, Sidera and Ser Brienne walked back out from the room, and she saw that Ghost seemed to almost be forcing them to do so. The worried looks they'd had on their faces when they entered were now even more pronounced. Just as Sidera seemed to be on the verge of saying something, the argument inside stopped and she could see their relief as calmer heads seemed to prevail. Again, she contemplated knocking on the door and walking into the room to speak to Aegon and Daenerys, and again she decided not to. Rhaenys instead, nodding to both Jorah and Brienne, and turning to go and break her fast. It was as she was walking to the area where they'd set up to have their meals that she saw him. Ser Jaime, looking as if he was just about to go and relieve one of the Dragon Guard, and now stopping in his tracks as soon as he noticed her. She had known they would have a need to speak at some point, given how close he was to her brother, and yet she had, without dodging the conversation, at least not sought it out. "Princess," Ser Jaime said, his voice shaky as he looked at her. "Ser Jaime," she replied, her own voice more than similar. "May we speak?" he asked, and she almost told him no, before she gave a small nod of her head and bid him follow. They walked in silence, the two of them barely looking at each other as they entered a room that led out onto one of the other terraces. No sooner had they reached it than she saw Balerion flying in the air and coming her way. With a smile and feeling herself relax knowing her dragon was seeking her out, she moved to the edge of the terrace and watched the blue dragon as she came in to land. Balerion was as large as a horse already, almost of a size with Learhawks, even though she was much younger than the red dragon. Her coloring had become more vivid and vibrant, and the blue of her body and wings was now more azure than anything else. There were some white spots on her belly, and around her eyes, and her flames were almost a deep purple, which reminded her so much of both her own and Aegon's eyes. Rhaenys stepped back when the dragon landed, and for the next few moments, Rhaenys ran her hands over Balerian's scales, as the dragon trilled to her touch. She giggled when she saw Balerian stretch out and fall to sleep, and it was to the sound of the blue dragon's quiet breathing that she turned to speak to Rhaenys. I know you have much you wish to speak to me on, Sir Jaime. Aegon has spoken to me of you, told me the things you've done since and on that day in the Red Keep. She said and saw him almost deflate as he looked at her. His words almost seemed to be forced out, and how hard it was for him to speak was instantly clear. It's taken me many years to understand things. Many years and many long nights, where I've cried myself to sleep as I realized just how cruel the gods can be. Fate is a strange thing, Sir Jaime, and my family's fate was a cruel one indeed. My brother was never to grow to be a man, my mother never to live to see her children grown. My father was not destined to hold my brother in his arms, or see his face. And as for Aegon, his fate was crueler even than mine own, she said with an almost bitter laugh. I'm sorry, Princess. If I'd known, Jaime said, and as she looked at him more closely, she could see the tears in his eyes. Then you'd have died, and the world we both now live in would have been a much different one. You and I are not gods, Sir Ivy. We are mere players in the great game, and here to carry out their will. I can hate you for the things you didn't do, or accept that by not doing them, I finally am here and part of a family once more. I chose the latter, she said, and he looked at her in stunned silence. I will not fail again, Princess. On that you have my solemn oath, he said after a few moments, his words seeming firm and true to her ears. See that you don't say my brother is far too precious to me for him to fall, she said, and he nodded. He gave her time alone after that, Jaime moving away from the terrace, and Rhaenys asked, though she felt her stomach rumble, deciding to stay there for a little longer. How long she stayed, she couldn't tell. But Balerion stayed asleep, and Rhaenys looked out on the city below, and the dragons that were flying in the air. She didn't hear the footsteps, or the quietness of the breaths. The girl took, and yet she knew that not only was she not alone anymore, but who it was who had joined her, without needing to turn around. I wondered when you'd seek me out, she said softly. I want to play a game, Arya Stark said, and Rhaenys chuckled as she turned to look the girl in her eyes. A game of faces, she asked to a small nod from Aegon's cousin who had been his sister when she could not. Very well, ask your questions, she said as the two of them now stood face to face. Why didn't you seek my brother out before now? Arya asked, her voice betraying some of the emotions she was feeling, here worry, jealousy, anger, more clear than perhaps she knew. It was not the time, Rosie had said softly. Why was it not the time? Arya asked. Because our fate was to meet when we met and not before. Had we done so then, things would have gone badly for us all, she said. More badly than they went for Jon? Arya asked. No, Rhaenys answered firmly. More badly than that went for you? Arya asked, her annoyance clear. No, she replied. More badly for who? Arya asked, almost confused. Everyone, she answered simply. She could tell that Arya wanted to ask her more about that, and Rosie's was in no true mood to pull more on that thread with her. Rosie's knew full well that she'd need to have that conversation with Daenerys at some point, or that perhaps Aegon was already doing so. So she decided to steer Arya's questions to where the girl truly wished them to be. Ask me about my brother and my intent. Arya Stark of Winterfell, she said, and the girl looked at her with a narrowing of her eyes. Do you mean my brother, Herm? Arya asked. No, Rhaenys replied. His wife or child, do you mean them harm? No. Do you love my brother? Arya asked, looking at her now more intently than ever. Yes, she said, smiling as she did so. For almost an hour she answered questions, and though the girl didn't tell her what she'd thought of her answers, she had no need to. Rosieres watched as Arya left, and then as Balerion woke and took to the air, after chirping to her for some time. She looked on as the blue dragon flew and was soon joined by her sister and brother Luriax and Drogon waiting for her, and then taking her with them as they flew towards the sea. They've gone to eat, she heard Aegon's voice say, and she smiled as she turned to see her brother standing there. Rhaenys feeling her stomach rumble when she saw the tray he carried in his hands. Is that for me? She asked hopefully. You've not eaten, Aegon said. I thought we could break our fast together. I'd like that, she said as she reached to the plate and picked up one of the sausages, almost devouring it as Aegon chuckled. I told Dany everything. The truth about you, about me, all of it, he said, as they sat and ate. Aegon barely doing so while she ate hungrily. I'm sorry, Egg, she said softly. We're good. Or we will be, he said, and she smiled, before she belched loudly, making him laugh. You sound like Roslia, he said, and she slapped him lightly on the shoulder as she said she did not, the two of them laughing happily as they ate and sat together. This was the life she was supposed to have, the life that had been denied to her. It was a life that never could have been had Tyrion not came to her all those years ago. A life that led down a different path than the one she would have lived had the gods not gifted her brother a second chance. In that life she'd never have met him, never have known him, and she'd have died bloody. While there was still a chance that was to be her fate in this one, she was far more willing to accept it if it was. Death held no fears for her. Dying alone, however, did. I have a surprise for you, Aegon said after they'd finished eating. A surprise? She asked, smiling broadly. Come with me, sister, he said as he rose to his feet and held his hand out to her. Taking his hand in hers, she was pleased when he didn't let it go as they walked through the Great Pyramid. Rosiernes wondered if he was simply taking her for a stroll through the streets of Meereen as he led her down the many steps to the bottom. Sir Jaime followed behind and served as her and her brother's protector. When they reached the bottom and walked out into the bright afternoon day, she was surprised to see Rosiacle waiting for them, and she felt her heart begin to race. Come, it's time you rode on a dragon, Aegon said, and she nodded eagerly as he helped her up onto Rhaegal's back. Norvos 306 AC. Arianne? They'd arrived to a large crowd welcoming them, and it caught her by surprise, as the Norvosi were not known for being so expressive in their emotions. Some of her lords and ladies had worried that just because they'd been asked to come to the aid of the city, they'd not be as welcome as her mother's letter had made out, that they'd be seen as a foreign army, and like all foreign armies, their arrival would be met with wariness, and perhaps even some anger. Once again, it was Ned Dane who stood and spoke as the voice of reason. Was that how King Aegon and Queen Daenerys' army was welcomed by Dorne, or did we welcome them as the allies and friends that they were? Ned said to nods, and she smiled as she looked at the young man. He'd been a good ally and was very supportive, and she and Daemon had been glad to have him on their side. Her paramour even coming around to the fact that she spoke so glowingly about another man, though some of that perhaps had to do with how her cousin had looked at him. Rosiernes being alive had been and still was a huge shock to her, and she hated that their time together had been so short. She'd not even begun to scratch the surface of the story of her cousin's survival and of the life she lived. So, when Abella and Elia had suggested that the latter stay with her, Arianne had only been too happy to agree. Perhaps she could learn what she had not the time to, and even if she could not, it made both her and Abella feel far better to know that her cousin now had family beside her. Not that Arianne didn't consider Aegon and Daenerys as Rhaenys' family, but someone from House Martell being with her cousin just felt right to them both. A part of her hoped that this city would come under attack and the dragons would be forced to come to their aid, just so she would see her cousin sooner rather than later. Though a larger part just hoped that their presence here would be enough to see the man who threatened her mother's home would think the better of it and seek another target. Your mother, Aerie, Daemon said from beside her, and she looked to the docks to see her mother standing there waving up at her. She returned the wave eagerly, and soon enough they were docked and she was in her mother's embrace once more. You came, thank the gods you came, her mother said happily as she held her in her arms. Of course I came. Did you think I would not? She asked, smiling as her mother shook her head. Daemon, it's good to see you again, her mother said as she kissed Daemon's cheeks. And then Arianne introduced her to Abella, who her mother welcomed just as warmly before her mother looked then at Aeryo and the scars he bore. My poor Aeryo, her mother said, touching the scars that had been inflicted upon him when her father lost his life. I am well and better for seeing you, my lady, the giant guard said, as he was embraced and held for some time by her mother. Once she had let him go, Arianne bid her mother join her as she moved to where Ned Dane was standing. And this is Lord Ned Dane of Starfall, Arianne said as she introduced her mother to Ned. Lord Dane, I knew you later aunt and uncle. The world is poorer without Lady Asha and Sir Arthur in it. Her mother said, that it is Lady Malario. It's an honor to meet you, Ned said. Ever polite as always. Daemon insisted that he stay behind to see their men settle, and Ned Dane decided to join him. So it was just Arianne, Obella, and Ario who rode with her mother to her manse. She knew that they'd at some point have to have an audience with the bearded priests and that her coming would increase her mother's favor with the true rulers of the city. Her mother didn't really speak much on the ride, and so Arianne was left alone with her thoughts and was free to look out on the people of the city who waved at them as they passed. Ned Dane's words coming back to her as she saw how happy the people were to see them here. It made her relieved and yet concerned at the same time. Norvos was a free and proud city and had faced adversaries before. Each time they'd either bought off their enemies, such as with the Dothraki, or hired a sellsword company to fight their battles for them, but Norvos had always stood and never fallen. For them to reach out to her, even given that her mother was one of the most influential voices in Norvos, showed how truly fearful they were. Something her mother only confirmed once they had reached the manse and were sitting down to some refreshments. I prayed my letter would reach you in time, Arianne, and then that you would arrive here before he turned his sights our way, her mother said, and Arianne for once heard true fear in her mother's voice. Who, Bellico? She asked. You know of him, her mother asked, and Arianne nodded. The truth of him, her mother added, and Arianne looked at her confusedly. He's a magister from Volantis, one of the tigers, she said, and her mother shook her head. That is just who he is to those who don't know. Bellico Stekon is the head of the Church of Starry Wisdom and believes himself to be the Bloodstone Emperor Reborn, her mother said, and Arianne looked to Obella, who looked just as confused as she. She wished right then that she'd brought Sorella with her, had she then no doubt her smart and learned cousin would tell them things about both this church and this Bloodstone Emperor that none of them knew. Obella was far more a warrior than a scholar, and while Arianne had never shirked in her studies, they were far more practical than lessons on myths from Essos. He sent an army to take Dorne from me. Used Quentyn to do so. Mine own brother tried to take my life, she said, and her mother nodded before asking her what had happened. It was not my order nor my blade that took Quentyn's life, mother. I'd not have sought his death, even though he sought mine, she said, and she moved to her mother when she began to cry. Arianne offering her what comfort she could give her. Bellico is insidious, Arianne. He speaks words and men do his bidding, thinking it their own ideas. I've no doubt that he did so with Quentyn, and while I mourn my son, I do so while being so relieved that it's my daughter who is here with me this day. Her mother said as she held her hand in her own, Queen Daenerys and King Aegon are here too, mother. They've sailed to take back Meereen, and should we need them, then they and their dragons will come to our aid, she said, and her mother looked at her. I fear we'll need them, Arianne, her mother said, and how she spoke the words chilled her to the bone. Miri Series 6 AC. Tormund. At first, he hated the heat. The sun would beam down on him, and it caused him to sweat like a stuffed pig. When they had traveled through the deserts of Dorne, he had thought he was to die there. He was convinced that he'd be found in a pool of his own making as his body turned from blood and bone to water. The nights were far more to his liking, and by the time they were ready to fight, he was ready to do whatever it took to stay cool. That, and only that, was the reason he accepted the clothing. For he knew as soon as he put them on, he'd be in for a torrid time. King Crow would stroll around in his black and look at him, and Tormund would see that smirk on his friend's face. Over time, though, he had grown to like the silks, enjoyed the way they felt on his skin, and how they stopped the worst of the sweating from taking place. It was why, when Grey Worm suggested a woman who could weave and make clothing that would be more to his liking, he'd gladly agreed to come with him to the woman's house. First, though, he had needed to get some coin, which meant speaking to his friend as Tormund Giantsbane didn't carry coin. He knew it would mean he'd get his balls busted and that Jon would take the piss out of him. And he was proved right, though he was also given a rather large pouch of coin, too. As they walked through the city, Tormund found he enjoyed it far more than the shit-smelling city where Davos and the others now ruled in Jon's and the Dragon Queen's stead. The people seemed happier, too, though given they'd just freed them. It was perhaps no real surprise that they would be. Grey Worm, Missandei, and others had suggested that he cut his hair and trim his beard, even going so far as to say he should cut it off, but that was a step too far. He could take some ribbing from Jon. Not that much, though, he thought with a chuckle, as they reached their destination. Baengir, a good woman, Tormund Giantsbane, Grey Worm said, and Tormund nodded as he knocked at the door. The woman who opened it was a beauty. Tall and fierce-looking, and though she was not as large as the big woman, she was larger than any of the others he'd seen since he'd joined back up with his friend. Even the Dothraki were smaller women, though they were very friendly, and the one in front of him looked anything but. It made him smile when she glowered at him, smile, even more, when he wiggled his eyebrows and she ground her teeth. This man a friend to King Aegon and Queen Daenerys. He seeks clothes and has coin to pay. Grey Worm said, and Daenerys nodded before bidding him enter her home or shop, or perhaps it was both. Grey Worm didn't even say goodbye. The man just disappearing back into the streets, and Tormund found himself standing in a large room that was full of cloth. Daenerys looked him up and down, and then a few moments later, he was slapped around his ear when he kissed her. Tormund looking at her with a confused look on his face as she'd touched him first. "I'm taking your size, not inviting you into my bed," the woman said, and Tormund was surprised that she spoke the common tongue. And then he was slapped once again as he laughed when he thought of lost he'd have been, had she not. "I wasn't laughing at you, Daenerys. I was laughing at my stupidity." "It seems it's not only Jon Snow who knows nothing," he said to a confused look from the woman. He decided wisely to shut up, as he could still feel the second of the woman's slaps, and soon enough she was done touching him, and as she had done so, he had kept his lips and hands to himself. When she was finished, she moved to a table and began to write some words and draw something before then bidding him join her. "How many?" Daenerys asked. "What will this get me?" he asked, taking out the pouch and removing a handful of coins that he handed to her. 5, 6 perhaps, Daenerys said as she looked at the coins. "Make it 6, he said, as he took out some more coins and handed them to her. When she brought him the cloth, his first instinct was to ask for the blacks, and so he did. Daenerys frowning at him but saying nothing. When he picked up a yellow piece, he saw her shake her head, and he looked at her and smiled. When she picked up a bright blue, by the time he'd left, he'd agreed to 3 blue, 2 green, and 1 black. Tormund, knowing that Jon would make fun of him regardless of the colors he wore, and yet he thought that a bit of color wasn't a bad thing to have in his life. It was night by the time he reached the Great Pyramid, and he was happy to find out that the meals hadn't started without him. After a quick change of clothes, he entered the room to find Jon holding his daughter in his arms and shaking his head at the bright yellow coat, open shirt, and blue breeches that he wore. He laughed loudly a moment later when he heard the words that Jon spoke to his daughter as he let him take her in his arms. "Aye, Raxela, your Uncle Tormund does look like a fool," Jon said with a smirk, and Tormund looked to the babe. "I saw your father's pecker once. Small and shivered it were. I'd rather look like a fool than that," he said, and he heard Jon's laugh as he got up from his seat, and once again he felt a slap on his head. Court 3006 AC. Jon Connington. If someone had told him that he'd be sailing with Greyjoys in the summer sea on a mission for House Targaryen, he'd have fallen to the floor in laughter. Yet here he was, on board the Black Wind with Theon Greyjoy and his sister Asha for company. All of them had been sent to see the layout of the land in course, and Jon Connington, the master of laws for a Targaryen king and queen, was now dressed as if he was a filthy reaver. Never could he have imagined this situation, even were he falling down drunk or doused up with a dose of milk of the poppy. He had always hated the Ironborn, had always felt that they and their pile of rocks needed to be purged and forgotten about. Given what they had done to his king's family, it surprised him that Aegon accepted them so easily, especially in Theon's case. He'd been standing there in the royal chambers when Theon and his sister had come to speak to the king and queen and to meet the princess, and had been surprised by what he saw. Jon expecting Aegon to demand that they left his sight, and yet instead he'd spoken to them both as if they were friends. The night before they set sail from Braavos, the king had come to speak to him, and despite telling him what it was that he wished for Jon to do, it was those he wished him to do it with that Jon felt the need to talk about. He needed to know why his king felt he could trust people who were and had shown themselves to be untrustworthy. "The Greyjoys, my king, can they be trusted?" Jon asked as they sat in the garden of the Sea Lord's palace. I believe so," Aegon said, looking at him before speaking some more. "I've known betrayal, Jon, known it better than most, from both sides, I'm shamed to say. Aisha Greyjoy is true to Daenerys, truer than almost any, and she has my wife's trust, and mine own. And the Yan, your grace?" he asked, and the Yan closed his eyes, no word spoken for what felt like an age, but was perhaps only a moment or two. "Identity is a hard thing, Jon. It's a strange thing to think of yourself one way and learn that's not who you are. For most of my life, I thought myself a bastard and wished more than anything to be wolf-like. My siblings. I wished to be Ned Stark's son more than anything in the world. Not his bastard, his son," Aegon said. Jon looked at Aegon as he closed his eyes once more, as he then moved his hand to them as if he was stopping tears from falling, though he saw none. "I thought him the epitome of what a man should be. That to be like him, to be him, was the greatest thing I could do with my life. Each time I fell short of what I thought him to be, it cut me to the bone. Then I found out that the man I thought him as was not the man he was. Far from it. It was an illusion, a mummery, a falsehood. And yet, for so many years, it defined me completely. There is but one man in this world who knows a life close to mine own. Do you know who that man is? Aegon asked. No, your grace, he answered honestly. The Thawne Greyjoy. Yaxud, catching him by surprise. It's taken him almost a lifetime to be who he's meant to be, too, and so, I trust him. Jon had watched the man carefully and had listened to him as they'd sailed and yet had found nothing of what his king saw in him. Perhaps the mission itself would prove his king more right than him, or perhaps Theon would fall and he'd not need to be so concerned. Whatever the truth of the man, he hoped he'd find it before it was too late, and Theon betrayed once more. He made his way to his cabin and was soon fast asleep. His night another dreamless one, and he woke in the morning to find that they had arrived at their destination. Of course, the greatest city there ever was, or ever will be, looked so very different than it had been when he'd come here before with the Golden Company. There was an air of something that, even from the bay, he could feel, and he looked to see Theon and Asha looking to the docks with apprehension. What it was that made him tell them to stop and turn the ship around, he wasn't sure, but some force or feeling made him shout it out loudly. Leave, we must leave. Now, he shouted as the two Greyjoys looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. We're on a mission for her grace, Asha said firmly. I'm telling you, we need to... The fireballs flew in the sky, and they looked on in horror as the sails of one of their escort ships caught fire. A moment later another one did, and he grabbed his marechaussee and looked to the docks to see men, or what looked like men at least. Moving to ships and boats, handing the marechaussee to Asha Greyjoy, he heard the loud gasp she made, and then she ordered the ships to turn. Hard left, she said, before pushing her helmsman away and taking charge herself. 5 ships they'd brought with them, and only one of them made it out of the bay. The men who'd sailed the others were all lost to them, and they had no chance to go back and save them. For the next day and night, they were in a race for their own lives. And Jon spent more time on deck than he did in his cabin or anywhere else. He ate on deck, slept on deck, when he could sleep that was, and when they finally left the ships behind them, it was to his, and the Greyjoys' great relief. What the fuck happened there? Those things were not men, Asha said as she drained a mug of ale. Were they what the king and queen faced in the north? This army of the dead? He asked, and Asha shook her head as she looked at Theon. I never saw them. I was with Sansa, Theon said almost shamefully. I heard the men talk, though. Their eyes were blue. Were their eyes blue? He asked, and Jon nodded. Aye, they were, Asha said, and Jon shuddered. Volantis 306 AC. Samwell Tarly. He waved off Gilly's concerns when she spoke of not trusting their host. The silly girl didn't or couldn't see how good they had it here. Sam had been given access to Belito's library, and it was extensive. They'd been provided with food of a quality and quantity that he had never known before. And he found himself almost gorging on the dishes from morning to night. It was no wonder that the Triarchs and Magisters of Usse were such large men. Unlike those fools in Westeros, they knew how to enjoy life here, and enjoy his life he very much had. When Bellico had first suggested that he could take one of the servants to bed, Sam had shaken his head and thought it to be a jape. His host, though, made it clear it was not, and when Sam then brought up that he was with Gilly, Bellico had laughed and told him that a real man didn't limit his options to one woman. The mere thought of it had made him hard and filled his nights with dreams of various different servants he saw through the day. Still, he had refused at first. The thoughts of Gilly hanging out and having to face her anger were enough to slow his libido right down. The longer it went without him being able to lay with Gilly, though, the more he considered it. What won him over in the end was the words that Belito spoke to him as they sat and spoke about Jon one night. Sam telling his host how Jon was far less clever than he was, and because of that, he had been caught by surprise when he'd confronted him in the crypts. Belito listening keenly to every word he spoke with great interest as Sam told him that he was sure it was because of Bran. Bran? Bellico asked. His brother, cousin. He was the three-eyed raven. Sam said before hiccuping loudly. And you think he made Jon Snow smarter? Bellico asked, and was he not as drunk as he was then? Sam probably would have been surprised that Bellico didn't ask him what the three-eyed raven was. I think he warned him beforehand. I think he played me, Jon. he said with a sniffle. Jon wasn't smart enough to know. He hiccuped again. And why do you think this three-eyed raven told Jon the truth? Bellico asked, and Sam shook his head. I think he had his own goals. He could see it all. All that had happened, or all that the loud fart, was thankfully just that, and he was relieved to see that Bellico didn't scold him or ask him to leave the room. Such things are because of a buildup of fluids, Samwell, Bellico said with a smile. Fluids? I thought it was wind. The books at the Citadel aren't as true as you believe them to be. Have you and Lady Gilly partaken in nightly activities? Bellico asked, and drunk as he was, Sam still blushed. With her condition, we can't, he said frustratedly. There are other ways a woman can help a man out, Samwell. Other things she can do to bring about his release. Bellico said, and Sam blinked his eyes rapidly as he looked at Bellico. There are? He asked eagerly. A woman may use her hand, or perhaps even her mouth. Ciela. Bellico called, and the young girl entered the room. Sam recognizing her as one of the servants he had dreamt about ever since his first talk with Bellico about their uses. Master, the girl asked nervously. Samwell is in need of your services, Bellico said, and Sam didn't see the worried look on the girl's face, as he instead found himself wondering just exactly what those services were. Ever since that night, he'd given in to his urges, just as he did with all his others since he'd gotten here. Bellico had even arranged another room for him to go to so he could hide his activities from Gilly. Sam thanking him profusely for everything he was doing for him and promising he'd do all he could to repay him. It was a few weeks after he'd started using the servants that Bellico had come looking for that payment. Sam told that he was needed to accompany Bellico on a trip and that Gilly would need to stay here because of her condition. When he'd gone to argue, Bellico had told him that there would be servants accompanying him on this trip and more in the places they would stay until they reached their destination. That alone was enough to make him wave off Gilly's concerns and her worries, not to mention her bemoaning the fact that he'd not be here when she whelped her pup. In that regard, he was even more pleased to be leaving with Bellico. Sam had no wish to have to pretend to care about the babe that was soon to be born or to show any interest in it whatsoever. It was hard enough to do that with young Sam, and he feared Gilly was starting to notice how little time he spent with her son. I'll be back as soon as I can, and Bellico assures me that you'll be safe here, he said as he was saying his goodbyes. What about me, Sam? What about us? Where you go, I go, Gilly said sadly, and he almost lost his temper with her before reining it in right at the end. You can't, though. You can't go where I go. The babe is coming, he said, and she kissed him softly as she nodded. He said nothing more and didn't look back, and as they made their way to the ship, he was pleased to see Ciela with them. The things that girl could do with her mouth were sinful, and he looked forward to enjoying sinning with her as they traveled together. Mirroring 36 AC. Aegon Targaryen. The flight on Rachel with his sister allowed him to stop thinking and just enjoy something. It was something he needed so very much after the morning he'd had. What possessed him to speak to Dany and tell her the truth of things he didn't know? But it had very nearly cost him everything. Seeing the hurt in her eyes, the worry and concern, and knowing that he was the reason for it, had almost broken his heart in two. When she'd told him to leave, demanded him to get out, a part of him had almost given in and done what she asked. Had he done so then, he would have been lost, and they would have never recovered. He knew that. He remembered so very vividly the words he'd spoken to her as they stood by the fire on the night of the feast in Winterfell. He had then left the room, and the gap between them had never been bridged from that moment on. The days that followed, where he had been glad that she didn't wish him to be in her presence or to be alone with her, just because it had allowed him to hide and to bury his feelings deep inside. This time he'd done it right. He'd stayed despite her anger and his own fear. He'd stayed, and they'd talked, and in time her knowing the truth would be for the best. In time at least. This time when he'd left the room, it was because others had come and Daddy had needed to break her fast, and not because he was running away. He'd spoken to Ser Jorah and Ser Brienne and had reassured them that their argument was simply that, and that he was being and acting a fool. When they told him that Rhaenys had been by, he knew he had to go to her. He had found her standing on the balcony and was glad he'd brought food so they could break their fast together. Then it was to the air, and as they flew and he heard her laugh, he whispered that it wouldn't be long until she was on Baelorion's back. The blue dragon flying back with them as they headed back to the Great Pyramid. By the time of their dinner that night, it was clear that other conversations had taken place. Arya seemed far more friendly with Raxley's, and Dany had welcomed him back to their rooms with a kiss and a rare smile. For the next few days, he'd spent his time sparring and readying for the next stage of their plans, while Dany held court and brought Mirren back to how it had once been. Both of them had split their time looking after Raxley, though they had no shortage of those willing to help. Missandei, Arya, and Raxley's, all keen to spend time with their daughter. They'd settled into a routine almost, and it was only the arrival of a letter from Volantis that shook them out of it. "Who is it from?" Dany asked as he broke open the seal after the message had been delivered to him. "Gilly," he said, surprised, and saw how Tormund looked at him. Rhaenys asked, and he was glad that Dany spoke to her and told her who Gilly was as he read the letter. "That fat fucking fool," he said angrily after he finished reading it. "Of all the things to do..." "Again?" Dany asked, and he looked at his wife as he began to read the letter to her and to the others. "Jon, can I call you Jon? I know your name is not that anymore, but I think of you that way. I'm writing to beg your forgiveness. Jon, for whatever it was that Sam did to upset and anger you. I love him. He's to be the father of my babe, and is already the father to little Sam. I don't like this place. It's too warm, and the people speak words I don't understand. I want to go home, to travel back beyond the wall, or to settle in the north in lands that I know and am happy in. Please, Jon, I beg you to give us leave to travel back home. Forgive Sam, and I swear you'll not hear from either of us again. The man we're staying with is nice and has been friendly, but this is not my home, and I don't want my children to be raised here. Triarch Bellico tells me that he'll give us the coin to sail back if you'll agree, and though I don't know what you and Sam fell out over, I hope that you'll grant me this favor. You were always good to me, and little Sam. Please be good to us once more." "Gilly," he said the words, and felt his anger grow with each of them. He'd known that Sam would never travel alone, that he'd be too much of a coward to do so, and it pained him that Gilly and her babes were so tied into the lies he spouted that they knew no better. "I should have fucking gutted him in the crypts. Should have sent Ghost after him or tracked his fat arse down and let Rhaegal have his way with him. I'll tear him limb from fucking limb when I find him. I swear it on the old gods that when he dies, it'll be with his screams carrying loudly in the wind." He said, not quite ranting or foaming at the mouth, but given the looks that everyone in the room were giving him, he may as well have been. Breathing deeply to calm himself before he spoke again, he looked to see the expressions they wore as they looked at him. Arya looked concerned, but not overly so, while Rosieras wore a far too similar look. Gendry looked almost panicked, and Missandei was torn between looking from him to Dany, whose own look was the most worried of all. Seeing it made him walk over to her and lean down to kiss her cheek, Aegon staring into her eyes to show that he'd not lost his mind. "I feel responsible for Gilly and little Sam, for the babe she carries. I've put them in danger and let my anger at Sam affect them. I should have just killed him, but I wanted him to suffer and live in fear. He deserves to be afraid," he said, and Dany nodded before kissing him back. "Then we'll make him afraid and see that Gilly and her children are safe," she said, and he nodded. It changed their plans, as it was now to be Volantis, rather than the other cities in the Bay of Dragons, or Corf, they were to go to. Lady Melora and Lady Kinvara both offering up no reasons why they shouldn't go to Volantis rather than anywhere else. The reasons for why they wouldn't be going there arrived a day or two later, when two of the ships they'd sent to Corf arrived in Meereen, and the tales that Jon Connington, Aisha, and Theon Greyjoy brought them changed the very nature of the war to come. "How can it be? We killed them all," Dany asked as he stood with her and Rhaenys on the balcony, and they watched the dragons as they flew in the sky. "Not all, no. This is where the true fight was always meant to be, Dainslew. This is why I was brought here, and why you and Aegon were always supposed to be joined as one." Rosier, "The dragon must have 3 heads, Dany said, and Aegon looked at her and held out his hand, holding out his other for Rhaenys, who took it gladly. "Together we killed a king, Dany. You and I ended the night, king and his whites. What chance does the so-called emperor and his own have against all 3 of us? Fire and blood. That's what we'll bring to Cafarth. And when we're done there, we'll bring it to the Bloodstone Emperor himself," he said as Beelarian let out a roar that was joined by Drogon and Rapagel's own